My name's Tavish Rowan Keller, 32 years old, born and raised in Boise, Idaho. I'm a graphic designer by trade, the kind of guy who's more comfortable with a sketch pad than a sleeping bag. I've got this mop of dark hair that's always a little too long and a habit of overthinking everything. Probably why I'm still single. Growing up, I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. My idea of adventure was binge-watching true crime docs. But last month, I got this wild itch to find myself, or some crap like that, so I borrowed my buddy's RAV4, packed it with gear I barely knew how to use, and drove out to Oregon for a solo camping trip. Destination? The Deschutes National Forest. Big mistake. The drive from Boise was long. About 7 hours of me singing off-key to keep myself awake. I'd picked Deschutes because I'd heard it was gorgeous. Towering pines, crisp air, and those lookout towers dotting the ridges like something out of a postcard. I figured I'd camp near one. Maybe climb up and play park ranger for a day. I'd even packed a sketchbook to draw the view. When I rolled into the forest, the SUV's tires crunching over pine needles, it felt like I'd stepped into a painting. The sun was dipping low, painting everything golden, and I found a spot near the base of Lookout Mountain. There's an old fire tower up there, rusted, creaky, but still standing. I thought it'd be cool to check out. Setting up camp was a disaster. I'm pretty sure my tent's leaning like it's drunk, and I stabbed myself with a stake twice, blood still under my fingernail. By the time I got a fire going, it was dark, and the woods were alive with chirps and rustles. I'm not gonna lie, it was kinda peaceful at first. I cracked open a beer, leaned back against a log, and just soaked it in. The air smelled like sap and earth, and I could see the silhouette of the lookout tower up the hill, barely lit by the moon. I remember thinking, Tavish, you're finally doing something real. Famous last words, right? I'd done some research before coming. Oregon's got its share of weird stories. Missing hikers, strange sightings, that kind of thing. I brushed it off as tourist bait. Boise's got its own urban legends, like that haunted asylum downtown, so I figured every place has its ghosts. Still, I'd printed out a map and a ranger's guide I found online. Some guy named Paulson wrote it, probably retired now. It mentioned the towers were built in the 30s, manned by rangers who'd spend months alone up there. Kinda lonely gig, if you ask me. I pictured some grizzled old dude scanning the horizon, sipping coffee from a tin mug. The first night was quiet, too quiet, maybe. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. The SUV was parked maybe 20 feet away, its outline just visible through the tent flap. I kept thinking about how far I was from Boise, from anything familiar. Out here, it's just me, the trees, and that tower looming like it's watching. I laughed it off. Nerves, right? I mean, I'd seen enough horror flicks to know the drill. Don't go into the woods alone. But I'm not that guy. I'm not the one who dies first. At least, that's what I told myself. Around 2 a.m., I woke up sweaty, my heart pounding. No idea why. Just one of those jolts, you know? I lay there, listening to the wind nudge the pines, and tried to shake it off. Probably just my city brain freaking out over the silence. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through some old pics, me and my dog, Ranger, back home. He's a mutt, all floppy ears and drool, and I missed him like crazy. Should have brought him, I thought. Maybe he'd have sniffed out whatever was making my gut twist. I didn't know it then, but that twist in my gut wasn't just nerves. Something about this place was off, something I couldn't pin down yet. I kept glancing at the tent flap, half expecting to see the tower's shadow stretch closer. It didn't, of course. It just sat there, a dark spike against the sky. I told myself I'd hike up to it tomorrow, snap some pics, maybe sketch it. Get the full experience. What's the worst that could happen, right? By morning, I was bleary-eyed but alive. The fire was ash, the air was cold, and I was already regretting not packing better coffee. I stared up at Lookout Mountain, the tower peeking through the mist like it was daring me to come closer. I should have listened to that little voice telling me to pack up and go home. But nah, I'm Tavish Rowan Keller, stubborn as hell. So I grabbed my bag and started planning my day. So there I was, standing at the edge of my campsite, staring up at Lookout Mountain like it was sizing me up right back. I'd chugged some instant coffee, tasted like dirt, but it did the trick, and decided I wasn't gonna let a little unease scare me off. I mean, I'd driven all the way from Boise to Oregon for this, right? No point wimping out now. The plan was simple. Hike up to the tower, poke around, sketch a little, then head back to camp. I stuffed my backpack with water, a sandwich, and my sketchbook, locked the SUV, and started up the trail. The air was crisp, the kind that bites your lungs, and I was feeling pretty good, until the first snag hit. About 20 minutes in, I realized I'd grabbed the wrong map. The one in my hand was some tourist thing from a gas station, not the ranger's guide I'd printed. Great job, Tavish. It showed the main trails, sure, but the path to the tower was a squiggly mess of dotted lines. I stopped, squinting at it, and tried to match it to the fork in front of me. Left or right? Left looked steeper, overgrown with ferns, while right had a faded signpost, too weathered to read. I flipped a mental coin and went right, figuring I'd see the tower soon enough. Spoiler, I didn't. The trail got rough fast. Roots snagged my boots, and the incline had me huffing like I'd never walked a day in my life. I'm not out of shape. Okay, maybe a little, but this was brutal. I kept glancing up, expecting that rusty tower to pop into view, but all I got was more trees. Then I noticed something weird. No birds. Like, none. Back at camp, they'd been chirping up a storm, but up here, dead quiet. It was disturbing, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off, told myself it was just my imagination running wild again. Half an hour later, I was lost. Full on, no clue where I am lost. The trail had petered out into a tangle of brush, and my phone had 0 bars. Shocker, right? I sat on a rock, gulping water, and tried to laugh it off. Well, Tavish, you wanted an adventure, I muttered. That's when I heard it. Not footsteps or anything cheesy like that, but a low hum. Faint, steady, like a machine idling somewhere deep in the woods. I froze, tilting my head to listen. It wasn't coming from the tower's direction, or what I thought was the direction. It was off, somehow. I decided to backtrack. No point wandering deeper into this scary mess without a clue. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but the forest looked different going down. Like the fork I'd passed? Gone. Just a wall of pines where it should have been. My stomach did a little flip, but I kept moving, telling myself I just missed it. That's when I saw the boot. Not on a foot. Mind you, just a single, muddy work boot, half buried in the dirt. It looked old, laces rotted, like it had been there forever. Creepy, sure, but I wasn't about to lose it over some trash. By the time I stumbled back to camp, the sun was dipping low again, and I was beat. The SUV sat there like a lifeline, all shiny and safe. I unlocked it, tossed my bag in, and slumped against it, catching my breath. That hum was still in my head, though faint, like it had followed me. I glanced up at the tower, barely visible through the trees now, and wondered if it was some old generator up there. Maybe a ranger was around, keeping the place running? I hadn't seen any trucks or signs of life, but it was possible. I started a fire, more for comfort than anything else, and heated up some beans. As I ate, I kept replaying the day, getting lost, that boot, the silence. It was all a little horror movie-ish, but I wasn't spooked yet, just annoyed. I decided I'd try the tower again tomorrow, stick to the main trail this time. No more heroics. I even cracked a beer and toasted the woods, like, you're not gonna win, Deschutes. Big talk from a guy who'd just gotten his ass handed to him by a hike. Night fell, and I crawled into my tent, dead tired. The hum was gone, or maybe I was too wiped to notice. I zipped up, pulled my sleeping bag tight, and tried to sleep. But as I drifted off, I kept picturing that boot. Whose was it? How'd it get there? And why did it feel like the forest was keeping secrets? I didn't have answers, but something told me I'd find out soon, whether I wanted to or not. Morning hit me like a slap. Cold, gray, and way too early. I crawled out of my tent, joints creaking, and blinked at the campsite. The fire was dead, the air smelled wet, and that tower up on Lookout Mountain was swallowed by fog. I'd slept like crap, dreams full of that damn boot chasing me through the woods. I shook it off, brewed some coffee, still awful, and decided today was the day. I was going to get to that tower, no excuses. I grabbed my bag, double-checked the gas station map, and headed out, leaving the SUV behind like a trusty sidekick. The trail was easier this time, or maybe I was just too stubborn to get lost again. I stuck to the main path, winding up through the pines, and kept my eyes peeled. No weird hum today, just that eerie quiet hanging over everything. About an hour in, I saw it, the tower poking through the mist, all rusted metal and cracked windows. It looked like something out of a scary movie, but I was pumped. I picked up the pace, boots crunching on gravel, and reached the base. A rickety ladder stretched up maybe 50 feet to the platform. My gut twisted, but I wasn't turning back now. Climbing that thing was a nightmare. Every rung groaned like it'd snap, and the wind kept tugging at me, cold as hell. I made it, though, hauled myself into the tower and stood there, panting. The view was insane, miles of forest rolling out, all foggy and green. Inside, it was a mess, dusty maps pinned to the walls, a busted chair, an old radio spitting static. I poked around, sketching the view in my book, when I spotted something carved into the desk. Ranger Paulson, 1987. Huh, same guy from the guide. That's when the radio crackled louder, spitting out a voice, garbled, but human. My heart jumped. I leaned in, fiddling with the dials, but it cut off. Just static again. Hello, I said, feeling dumb. Nothing. Probably old tech acting up, right? But then I saw it through the window. A figure down the hill, near the trees. Tall, lanky, dressed in dark clothes. A ranger, maybe? I waved, but they didn't move, just stood there, staring up. Disturbing as hell. I grabbed my binoculars, but by the time I focused, they were gone. Poof, like they'd never been there. My skin prickled, and I told myself it was just some hiker messing with me. I decided to head down, sketching could wait. But as I hit the ladder, I heard it. Boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, coming from below. I froze, peering over the edge. Nothing, just mist and trees. Hey, anyone there? I called. Silence. My hands were sweaty now, slipping on the rungs as I climbed faster. Halfway down, I saw it, a flash of movement, dark against the fog. Not a deer, not a bear. Human-shaped, ducking behind a rock. Okay, Tavish, don't panic, I thought. Probably just a ranger doing rounds. Yeah, right. Back on solid ground, I booked it down the trail, glancing over my shoulder every 5 seconds. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing on me. That's when I tripped, face planted right into the dirt. As I scrambled up, I saw it. Another boot, same style as yesterday, tucked under a bush. This one had a sock still in it, stained, torn, and way too creepy. I backed away, heart hammering, and that's when I heard the hum again. Louder, closer, like it was right behind me. I spun around, nothing but trees. This wasn't funny anymore. I made it back to camp, legs shaking, and collapsed by the SUV. The tower was out of sight now, hidden by the ridge, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was watching me. I kept replaying it. The figure, the boots, that damn hum. My brain screamed, get out, but I'd left my keys in the tent like an idiot. As I rummaged for them, I found something else, a crumpled note under my sleeping bag. Scrawled in shaky pen, it said, "They don't leave." No idea how it got there, but it turned my blood to ice. I sat there, keys in hand, staring at the woods. The fog was thicker now, rolling in like it wanted to swallow me whole. Something was seriously wrong, horror-level wrong. I could feel it in my bones, like the forest was alive and pissed. I told myself I'd pack up and go, but part of me knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. I sat there by the SUV, clutching that creepy note, "They don't leave," and my brain was screaming at me to move. The fog was so thick now I could barely see the tent, and the air felt wrong, like it was buzzing with something nasty. I scrambled up, tossed my gear into the back, tent stakes clattering, sleeping bag half zipped, and jumped into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so bad, I dropped the keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tires spinning on pine needles as I peeled out of that cursed campsite. No way was I sticking around to find out who they were. The dirt road was a blur, branches scraping the sides of the SUV like bony fingers. I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting that lanky figure from the tower to pop up, but it was just fog and trees. Too much fog, swallowing everything. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine. I'd mapped this route from Boise, should have been a straight shot to Highway 20, but the turns weren't lining up. The road twisted sharper, narrower, like it was hurting me somewhere. Then the headlights caught it. A rusted gate blocking the path, padlocked shut. No way out. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop, and just sat there, breathing hard. "Okay, Tavish, think," I muttered. "Backtrack? Find another route." I didn't have a damn clue where I was anymore. That's when the hum kicked in again, louder, vibrating through the dashboard. I whipped around, scanning the woods, and saw them, Shapes in the fog. Not one, not two, dozens. Tall, thin, moving slow, like they were drifting toward me. My stomach dropped. This was horror movie level bad, and I was the idiot who didn't leave sooner. I threw the SUV into reverse, flooring it back the way I came. The shapes didn't chase. They just watched, heads tilted, like they knew I'd screw myself eventually. The road was a mess. Ruts, rocks, fallen branches, and I swerved like a maniac, praying the tires wouldn't blow. Then I hit it. A ditch I hadn't seen, cloaked by the fog. The front end nosedived, metal crunching, and I lurched forward, smacking my head on the wheel. Blood trickled down my forehead, warm and sticky, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I kicked the door open and stumbled into the fog, legs wobbly, head spinning. The hum was deafening now, like a swarm of bees in my skull. I grabbed my phone, still no signal, and started running blind, crashing through brush. Those shapes were closer, their outlines sharper, ragged clothes, pale faces, eyes like black pits. Rangers? Hikers? Something worse? I didn't stop to ask. I just ran, thorns tearing at my jeans, lungs burning, until I tripped over something soft. A body, old, decayed, still in a park ranger uniform. A scream stuck in my throat. I scrambled up, bolting again, and spotted a flicker of light ahead, red, blinking, like a beacon. The tower? No, too low. I didn't care. I aimed for it, dodging trees, my boots sinking into mud. The shapes were gaining, silent but fast, and I could feel their cold creeping up my spine. The light turned out to be a taillight, an abandoned truck, half-rusted, keys still in it. I dove in, slammed the door, and turned the key. It sputtered, coughed, then roared awake. Thank God for small miracles. I gunned it, the truck lurching forward, tires chewing dirt. The shapes were everywhere now, lining the road, reaching out with bony hands. One got close, too close, and I saw its face, hollow, grinning, like it had been waiting for me. I swerved, clipping it, and heard a sickening crunch. The truck fishtailed but kept going, and I didn't look back. The fog thinned just enough to show a gravel road, real this time, and I followed it, praying it'd spit me out somewhere safe. I drove for what felt like hours, knuckles white, blood dripping into my eye. The shapes faded, the hum dulled, but I wasn't dumb enough to think I'd won. That ranger's body, those things, they weren't letting me off easy. I kept checking the mirrors, waiting for them to pop up again, and wondering how the hell I'd explain this to anyone back in Boise. Assuming I made it that far. I kept that truck screaming down the gravel road, my hands locked on the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me sane. The fog was peeling back, letting me see patches of sky, gray, heavy, but real. My head throbbed where I'd smacked it, blood crusting on my eyebrow, and every breath felt like a fight. I didn't know whose truck this was or how it had saved my ass, but I wasn't stopping to write a thank you note. Those things, those creepy, hollow-eyed freaks, were still out there, and I could feel it, like they were biding their time, waiting for me to mess up again. The road spat me out onto Highway 20, and I almost laughed, relief hitting me like a punch. I floored it towards Sisters, the nearest town, the truck rattling like it might fall apart. The hum was gone, the shapes nowhere in sight, but my gut wouldn't settle. I kept replaying it. The tower, the boots, that ranger's corpse. What the hell had I stumbled into? Back in Boise, I'd laughed off ghost stories. Now I was living one, and it was way too disturbing to brush off. I needed a plan, gas, food, maybe a hospital for my head. Then home. Screw camping forever. I rolled into Sisters around dawn, the truck coughing as I pulled into a gas station. The clerk, a kid, maybe 19, gave me a weird look when I stumbled in, bloody and wild-eyed. Rough night, he asked, ringing up my coffee and jerky. You don't want to know? I muttered, tossing him cash. I sat in the truck, scarfing it down, and watched the sun creep up over the mountains. Normal life, people pumping gas, a dog barking, felt surreal after that horror show. I almost convinced myself it was over. Almost. That's when I made the mistake. I should have kept driving, straight back to Boise, but I didn't. My sketchbook was still in the SUV, along with my wallet. Stupid, yeah, but I'd left it in a panic. I couldn't just abandon it. I'd borrowed that rig from my buddy, and explaining this mess without proof sounded insane. So I turned the truck around, promising myself I'd be quick, grab my stuff and bolt. The highway stretched back toward Deschutes, and every mile felt like a rope tightening around my neck. The campsite looked different in daylight. Empty, quiet, the fog burned off. The SUV sat there, untouched, like nothing had happened. I parked the truck, hopped out, and jogged over, keys jangling in my shaky hand. I grabbed my bag, wallet, sketchbook, everything I needed. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. Footprints, fresh ones, circling the tent. Not mine. Too big, too deep. My throat went dry. I backed toward the truck, scanning the trees, and that's when the hum started again. Low, mean, vibrating up my spine. They came fast this time. No slow creep, no warning. Dozens of them, pouring from the woods, those hollow faces locked on me. I sprinted, dove into the truck, and cranked the key. It sputtered, once, twice, then died. No, come on, I yelled, slamming the dash. The shapes closed in, hands clawing at the windows, smearing dirt and something darker. I tried again, nothing. Panic clawed my chest as the glass cracked, their fingers prying through. I kicked at the door, screaming, but it was too late. I don't know how long I fought, seconds, minutes, but it wasn't enough. They dragged me out, cold hands on my arms, my legs, my throat. I thrashed, yelled for help that wouldn't come, and saw one last thing. The tower on the ridge, watching like it had planned this all along. Then it went dark. I think about Boise sometimes. Ranger, my dog, probably waiting for me. My buddy's SUV, still out there. Me, Tavish Rowan Keller, just another ghost story for Oregon now. Tragedy's a funny thing, you know? I wanted an adventure, a break from my boring life, and I got it. Just not the kind I'd hoped. If you're ever in Deschutes, steer clear of Lookout Mountain. Those rangers, or whatever they are, don't mess around. And if you find a sketchbook with my name on it, well, maybe say a prayer for me. I could use it. Why'd I let her talk me into this? That's the question gnawing at me as I sit here, replaying how I ended up in this damn forest. My name's Juniper Sage Hartley, 28 years old, born and raised in Eugene, Oregon. Well, close enough to call it home. I'm a barista by day, wannabe poet by night, with curly red hair I can't tame and a caffeine addiction that's probably gonna kill me someday. I'm not big on nature. Give me a rainy day and a book over bugs and dirt any time. But my best friend, Marlo, begged me to come camping. Said it'd be inspiring. So here I am, miles from Eugene, in the Umpqua National Forest, with her beat-up Silverado parked nearby. Big regret already brewing. The drive from Eugene was about 2 hours, me riding shotgun while Marlo blasted her weird folk playlists. She's the outdoorsy one, tall, wiry, with a grin that could charm a bear. We've been tight since high school, and she's always dragging me into stuff like this. Umpqua's this sprawling chunk of Oregon, rivers, cliffs, and these old lookout towers perched on the ridges. Marlo wanted to camp near one, someplace called Fall Creek Tower. She'd heard it was haunted or something, which I laughed off. I mean, I'm from Eugene. We've got our share of spooky tales, like that old mill by the river where kids swear they see shadows. No big deal, right? We rolled into the forest late afternoon, the truck bouncing over ruts as Marlo hooped like a kid. I just gripped my coffee thermos tighter. The spot we picked was tucked under some massive firs, maybe a mile from the tower's base. It's this rickety thing, all weathered wood and peeling paint, sticking out against the skyline. Setting up camp was a mess. I'm useless with tents, and Marlo had to redo my knots twice. She teased me about it, calling me city girl, while I flicked pine needles at her. By dusk, we had a fire crackling, and I'll admit, it wasn't half bad. Stars popping out, the air crisp and smoky. Marlo's got this thing for park ranger stories. She'd been rambling about them all day. Said Umpqua's towers used to be manned by these lone rangers, watching for fires, living off canned beans and grit. She'd even brought a beat-up book she found at a thrift store, some ranger's journal from the 60s. I skimmed it while she cooked. Guy named Ellis wrote about long nights and weird stuff in the woods. I rolled my eyes, but she was hooked, saying we should hike up to the tower tomorrow. I shrugged, figuring I'd humor her. What's a little climb, right? First night was chill. Too chill, maybe. We roasted marshmallows, swapped dumb stories, and I scribbled some half-baked poem about the firelight. Marlo crashed early, snoring in her sleeping bag, while I stayed up, sipping coffee and staring at the flames. The truck was parked close, its outline all boxy and safe, and I kept glancing at it, like it had whisked me back to Eugene if I begged hard enough. The tower was just visible through the trees, a dark splinter against the moon. I told myself it was cool, artsy even, not creepy. Then came the wake-up call, middle of the night, pitch black. I jolted awake, heart racing, no clue why. Marlo was still out cold, but something felt off. The fire was down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No crickets, no wind. I fumbled for my phone, the light harsh on my eyes, and checked the time. 3:17 a.m. I lay there, listening, trying to shake that prickly feeling. Probably just me being paranoid, you know? I mean, I'd grown up hearing Eugene's ghost stories. Nothing ever got me. But as I settled back, I caught it, a flicker up by the tower. Not a star, not a plane. A light, faint and yellow, winking on and off. I sat up, squinting through the tent flap. It was gone in a blink, but my stomach flipped. Just a ranger or something. I whispered to myself, clutching my thermos like a lifeline. Moments later, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I'd said yes to this trip. Marlo owed me big time. Morning rolled in slow, gray and damp. I crawled out of the tent, bleary-eyed, while Marlo bounced around, already plotting our tower hike. I grumbled, brewing coffee over the fire, and kept glancing up at that damn tower. It looked closer in the daylight, like it had shifted overnight. Probably just my tired brain playing tricks. I told Marlo about the light, half joking, but she got this glint in her eye, like she'd been waiting for something weird to happen. I should have known then I was in for more than I'd bargained for. So there I was, hunched over the campfire, nursing my coffee while Marlo bounced around like a kid on a sugar high. Morning in Umpqua was damp and chilly, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones. I'd barely slept after spotting that weird light up by the tower, but Marlo? She was all in, already packing her bag for the hike. "Come on, Junie, it'll be fun," she chirped, tossing me a granola bar. Fun, right. I grumbled something about needing more caffeine, but she just grinned and dragged me along. The truck sat there, tempting me to bail, but I caved. Should have listened to that little voice saying stay put. The hike up to Fall Creek Tower started easy enough, just a dirt trail winding through the firs. Marlo led the way, rattling off trivia from that ranger's journal she'd brought. Ellis said he saw stuff up here. Lights, shapes, weird crap, she said, eyes gleaming. I snorted, kicking a pine cone. Yeah, 'cause rangers never get bored and make up ghost stories. She shoved me playfully, but I couldn't shake last night's vibe. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just our boots crunching. It was starting to feel a little scary, you know? About halfway up, things got messy. The trail split, two paths, no signs. One was wide, packed dirt, heading left. The other was narrow, overgrown, veering right toward the tower's ridge. Marlo pulled out the journal, flipping pages like it was a treasure map. Ellis mentions a shortcut, she mumbled, pointing right. I squinted at the tangle of ferns and roots. That's a shortcut? Looks like a bear's bathroom. She laughed, but I wasn't kidding. I'm from Eugene, not the wilderness. We argued for a sec, then she won. Off we went, bushwhacking through the mess. Big mistake. 10 minutes in, I tripped over a root, twisting my ankle. Pain shot up. I didn't break anything, just a sprain, but it hurt like hell. Marlo fussed over me, propping me against a tree while I cursed my life choices. We should head back, I said, wincing as I tested my weight. She hesitated, glancing up the trail. We're so close, Junie. Let's just peek at the tower. I groaned, but gave in. Stubborn streak's gonna get me killed someday. She helped me limp along, the tower's outline poking through the trees now, all crooked and eerie. That's when I noticed it. The air got heavy, like a storm was brewing, but the sky was clear. No wind, no bugs buzzing, nothing. Marlo didn't seem to clock it, too busy chattering about ranger legends. Then I saw the mark, carved into a tree, rough and fresh, a jagged E. Ellis, I muttered, pointing. Marlo's eyes lit up, but my stomach sank. It didn't look old, too clean, too deep. Maybe someone's messing with us, I said, trying to laugh it off. She shrugged, but I wasn't buying my own excuse. This was getting disturbing. We kept going, me hobbling, her half carrying me. until the tower loomed right above us. It was uglier up close, with splintered, windows cracked, a ladder dangling like it'd snap if you sneezed on it. Marlowe wanted to climb, but I put my foot down. Well, my good one. No way. I'm not dying for your ghost story. She pouted but agreed to just poke around the base. That's when I heard it. A faint whistle, sharp and quick, like someone calling a dog. I froze. You hear that? Marlowe cocked her head, then shook it. Nope. Wind, maybe. But there was no wind. I brushed it off. Had to, or I'd freak out right there. We sat by the tower, munching granola, while I iced my ankle with a cold water bottle. Marlowe sketched the tower in her notebook, all artsy and carefree, but I couldn't relax. That whistle kept echoing in my head, and that E on the tree felt like a warning. I kept scanning the woods, expecting some grizzled ranger to pop out and yell boo. Nothing. Just us and that creepy tower, sitting there like it owned the place. By late afternoon, my ankle was swollen, and I was done. Let's head back, I said, hobbling up. Marlowe sighed but nodded, slinging my arm over her shoulder. We started down, slower this time, and I kept glancing back at the tower. It didn't move, obviously, but it felt like it was watching us go. I told myself I was just tired, jumpy from the fall. But deep down, I knew something was off, something horror level off, and we were still stuck out here with it. So there we were, hobbling back down that overgrown trail, my ankle throbbing like a drumbeat, while Marlowe half dragged me along. The sun was dipping low, painting the Umpqua woods in this orangey glow, and I just wanted to be back at camp, safe in the truck with a coffee in hand. Marlowe was quiet for once. No ranger tales, just focused on getting us down. I kept my eyes on the ground, avoiding roots, but I couldn't shake that whistle from earlier. It was stuck in my head, sharp and creepy, like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Then it happened again, real this time, slicing through the air. We both froze. Did you hear that? I hissed, gripping her arm. Marlowe nodded, eyes wide, scanning the trees. It wasn't wind, too clear, too human. Maybe a hiker, she whispered, but her voice wobbled. I didn't buy it. Hikers don't whistle like that, like they're calling something. We stood there, breath fogging in the chilly air, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't, but the silence was worse, thick, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. My skin prickled, and I knew this was about to get scary. We started moving again, faster now, my ankle screaming with every step. The tower was out of sight behind us, but I kept glancing back, half expecting it to pop up like some horror flick monster. That's when I saw it, something moving, quick and dark, darting between the trees. Not a deer, not a person, just a shape, low and wrong. Marlowe, look. I pointed, but it was gone before she turned. What? She asked, squinting. Something's out there, I said, my voice shaking. She tried to laugh it off. Probably a fox, Junie, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. We hit the wider trail, closer to camp, and I thought maybe we dodged whatever that was. Wrong. The whistle came again, louder, closer, splitting the dusk like a knife. This time, Marlowe grabbed my hand, and we booked it, me limping like a wounded animal. Then we saw the tracks, big, muddy prints crossing the path, too long and weird to be human. They trailed off into the brush, and I swear I saw something glint in there. Eyes? Metal? I couldn't tell, but it was disturbing as hell. What the crap is that? I yelped. Marlowe didn't answer, just pulled me along. Back at camp, we collapsed by the truck, panting, my ankle swollen to twice its size. The fire was cold, the tent sagging, and the woods felt alive, like they were closing in. We need to go, I said, fumbling for the keys in Marlowe's bag. She nodded, but then we heard it, a thud, heavy and deliberate, from the trees. We whipped around, and there it was, a figure, tall and hunched, standing just beyond the firelight. Not a ranger, not a hiker, something else, draped in ragged clothes, face hidden in shadow. My heart slammed into my ribs. Marlowe, get in the truck, I yelled, shoving her toward it. She scrambled, but I couldn't move fast. My ankle buckled, and I hit the dirt. The figure didn't rush, just stepped closer, slow and sure, like it knew I was screwed. I crawled, clawing at the ground, while Marlowe screamed my name from the driver's seat. That's when I saw the others. More shapes, creeping out from the woods, surrounding us. They weren't human, not anymore. Hollow eyes, twisted limbs, moving like puppets on strings. Pure horror. I made it to the truck, hauling myself in as Marlowe cranked the engine. The thing, the first one, lunged, slamming a bony hand against my window. Glass splintered, and I screamed, kicking at it while Marlowe floored it. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning, and we peeled out, those freaky things fading into the dark. But they didn't chase, just stood there, watching, like they were letting us run. My hands shook as I clutched the door, blood pounding in my ears. "What were those?" Marlowe whispered, voice cracking. I didn't have an answer, just a sinking feeling we'd poked something awful. We barreled down the dirt road, the truck rattling, and I kept checking the mirrors. Nothing but trees, but I wasn't fooled. The air buzzed, like static before a storm, and I realized the journal was still in Marlowe's bag. Ellis's words flashed in my head. Lights, shapes, weird crap. This wasn't some campfire tale. It was real, and we were in deep. Camp was behind us, but the terror was just starting, and I had no clue how we'd get out of this alive. I clung to the truck's door handle like it was my last lifeline, my ankle throbbing and my heart slamming so hard I thought it'd bust out of my chest. Marlowe had the pedal to the floor, the truck bouncing over ruts like a bucking horse, headlights slicing through the dark. Those things, those twisted, hollow-eyed freaks, were out of sight, but I kept checking the mirrors, expecting them to pop up any second. "Just keep driving," I rasped, my voice all shaky. Marlowe nodded, white-knuckling the wheel, her usual grin long gone. We were in some scary life-or-death mess now, and all I wanted was to see Eugene again. The dirt road twisted through Umpqua, trees clawing at the truck like they wanted in. I could still feel that thing's bony hand on the window, glass cracking, cold seeping through. My side still stung where I'd scraped it crawling in, and I was pretty sure I'd left half my sanity back at camp. "Where's the highway?" I asked, digging through Marlowe's bag for her phone. "No bars, big surprise." She muttered something about Highway 138, but the turns weren't matching up. It was like the forest was screwing with us, bending the roads into a trap. Then it hit. The truck sputtered, coughed, and slowed. "No, no, no," Marlowe yelled, smacking the dash. The gas gauge blinked empty. Hadn't even noticed it in the panic. We rolled to a stop, engine ticking, surrounded by nothing but pines and darkness. My stomach dropped. "We're dead," I whispered, scanning the woods. That's when the whistle came back, sharp, close, cutting through the silence like a blade. Marlowe grabbed my arm, and we saw them, shadows shifting, closing in, those hollow eyes glinting in the headlights. This was horror-level bad, and we were sitting ducks. "Out now," I barked, kicking my door open. Marlowe hesitated, then followed, dragging her back. My ankle screamed as I hit the ground, but adrenaline had me moving, limping fast into the trees. Those things were coming, slow but relentless, their ragged shapes spreading out like a net. I grabbed Marlowe's hand, pulling her toward a ravine I'd spotted, steep, rocky, but maybe a way out. We slid down, dirt and pine needles flying, my leg buckling halfway. She caught me, and we ducked behind a boulder, panting, listening as the whistles multiplied, too many to count. They were above us now, peering over the edge, heads tilted like they were curious. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a sob, while Marlowe rummaged in her bag. She pulled out a flare gun, some camping junk she'd packed, and I almost hugged her. "Good call," I whispered. She aimed up, fired, and a red streak lit the sky, scattering the shapes for a sec. We bolted, me hobbling, her half carrying me, toward a faint rumble. Water? A river. If we could cross it, maybe we'd lose them. It was a long shot, but I wasn't ready to die out here. The Fall Creek roared ahead, fast, icy, cutting through the forest. We hit the bank, and Marlowe waded in, pulling me along. The cold bit hard, soaking my jeans, but those things were right behind us, splashing in too. One grabbed my jacket. I screamed, twisting free, losing a sleeve. Marlowe swung the flare gun like a club, cracking one in the face. It staggered, but more kept coming. We stumbled onto the far bank, drenched and freezing, and I saw it. Headlights, real ones, bouncing down a road nearby. "Go," I yelled, shoving her ahead. We ran, me tripping every other step, those freaks closing in with their creepy, silent chase. The headlights belonged to a beat-up Jeep, some late-night fisherman, maybe. I waved like a maniac, screaming, and it screeched to a stop. An old guy leaned out, grizzled and confused. "Help us!" Marlowe shouted, and we dove into the back, me sprawling across the seat. He didn't ask questions, just gunned it, tires spinning, as those things reached the road, clawing at the air. I watched them shrink in the rear window, my chest heaving, blood and river water dripping everywhere. The Jeep tore down the road, the guy muttering about damn kids and crazy nights. I didn't care. We were alive, for now. Marlowe clutched the journal, her hands shaking, and I realized we'd lost the flare gun, my phone, half our gear. Those things didn't follow, but I felt their eyes on us, like they knew we'd slipped away. The old guy said he'd drop us in Roseburg, and I nodded, too wrecked to argue. We'd escaped, yeah, but something told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Jeep rattled down the road toward Roseburg, the old guy up front grumbling about fish biting better at night, while Marlowe and I sat in the back, soaked and shivering. My ankle was a mess, swollen, purple, pulsing with every bump, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. We'd made it out of Umpqua, those hollow-eyed freaks fading into the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling they weren't done with us. Marlowe clutched that damn journal like it was a lifeline, her face pale, lips pressed tight. I wanted to tell her to chuck it out the window, but my voice was stuck somewhere between terror and exhaustion. All I could think was how close we'd come to not making it. Roseburg hit us like a slap of reality, streetlights, a gas station, actual people. The old guy dropped us at a diner, muttering something about calling the cops if we wanted. We didn't, just stumbled inside, dripping river water, and collapsed into a booth. The waitress, a tired woman with a name tag reading Bev, raised an eyebrow but brought us coffee without a word. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat sink in, and finally croaked, "We're alive, right?" Marlowe nodded, but her eyes were glassy, like she was still seeing those things clawing at the truck. This was horror we couldn't unsee. We pieced it together over greasy fries and more coffee. The journal, Ellis's ramblings about lights and shapes, had to be tied to those freaks. Marlowe flipped it open, hands trembling, and read aloud. "They come when you stay too long. Rangers who never left." My stomach twisted. "Great, so we pissed off some ghost squad," I said, trying to joke. But it wasn't funny. It was disturbing as hell. We'd escaped. Yeah, but my gut screamed we'd left something unfinished. I should have listened to that instinct and stayed put, called for help. Instead, I made the dumbest call of my life. See, the truck was still out there, Marlowe's pride and joy, stuck in the woods with our gear. She begged me to go back for it. "We can't just leave it, Junie. It's got my camera, my sketches." I groaned, head pounding, but she had that look, the one I can't say no to. So after a couple hours of warmth and caffeine, we borrowed Bev's phone, called a tow guy we found in a phone book, and headed back. Dumb, right? I knew it, but I figured daylight would keep us safe. Those things hadn't chased us far. Maybe they were tied to the tower, the forest. I was so wrong. We met the tow guy, a burly dude named Chet, just off Highway 138. He followed us in his rig, me limping, Marlowe fidgeting with the journal. The truck was right where we'd left it, dead, battered, surrounded by those weird prints in the mud. Chet whistled, hooking it up while I scanned the trees. The sun was high, but the air felt off, buzzing like before. "Hurry up," I muttered, leaning on a stick I'd grabbed for a crutch. That's when the whistle hit. Low, mean, slicing through the daylight. My blood froze. Marlowe, they're back. They came fast, no shadows this time, just straight out of the woods. Dozens of them, ragged, hollow, moving like a wave. Chet yelled, dropping his chains, but they were on him in seconds, dragging him down. I screamed, grabbing Marlowe, and we ran, me hobbling, her pulling, toward his tow rig. The keys were in it, thank God. I dove into the passenger seat, Marlowe cranked the engine, and we peeled out, those things swarming the truck behind us. I saw Chet's arm flail, then go still, and I choked on a sob. We'd gotten him killed. We barreled toward Roseburg, the tow rig shaking, Marlowe crying so hard she could barely see. I kept yelling, "Go, go," like it'd make a difference. The shapes didn't follow far, just lined the road, watching, like they'd claimed what they wanted. We hit town, slammed into the sheriff's lot, and spilled the whole messy story. Camping, the tower, the attack. They didn't buy it, not fully, but sent a crew out. Found Chet's body, the truck half torn apart, no sign of those things. Official word? Bear attack, Yeah, right. I'm back in Eugene now, crashing at Marlowe's place 'cause I can't be alone. My ankle's in a brace, my head's a wreck, and every whistle, wind, a kettle, sends me spiraling. Marlowe burned the journal, but it doesn't matter. We lost Chet, the truck, our nerve. Umpqua took a piece of us, and those rangers, or whatever they are, won. If you're ever near Fall Creek Tower, don't stop. Don't look. Just run. 'Cause I didn't, and it cost us everything. I should have known this place would chew me up and spit me out. That's the thought rattling in my head as I sit here, piecing together how I landed in this mess. My name's Soren Elias Voss, 35 years old, hailing from Salem, Oregon, a city guy through and through. I'm a mechanic by trade, good with engines, not so much with people, sporting a scruffy beard and hands stained with grease no soap can touch. I'm not big on camping. Give me a garage and a cold beer over mosquitoes any day, but my sister, Tilda, roped me into this. Said we needed family time. So here I am, in the Willamette National Forest, my truck parked nearby, regretting every mile from Salem. The drive from Salem was a solid 3 hours, Tilda riding shotgun, yapping about how we'd unplug and bond. She's 30, a nurse with a wild streak, blonde hair always in a messy bun, and a knack for dragging me out of my comfort zone. Willamette's this huge stretch of Oregon, rivers, peaks, and these old lookout towers perched like forgotten sentinels. Tilda picked a spot near Three Sisters Wilderness, close to a tower called Black Crater. She'd heard it had a vibe, ranger stories, weird history. I shrugged it off. Salem's got its own tales, like that haunted bridge kids swear glows at night. Figured it was just hype. We pulled into the forest mid-afternoon, the truck rumbling over gravel as Tilda pointed out deer like a tour guide. I wasn't sold, too quiet, too far from a decent signal, but she was beaming, so I played along. We set up camp in a clearing, maybe a half-mile from the tower's base. It's this hulking thing, metal and wood, weathered gray, sticking out of the ridge like a broken tooth. Pitching the tent was a circus. I'm handy with tools, but stakes? Nope. Tilda laughed as I swore, finally taking over while I started a fire. By dusk, it was cozy, flames popping, stars winking through the pines. Tilda's obsessed with ranger lore. She dug up some old article about Black Crater online. Said it was manned back in the day by guys who'd go half mad from the isolation, spotting fires, and other stuff. She even brought a grainy photo she'd printed, some ranger named Hagen standing stiff by the tower in 72. I teased her. What? You think he's still up there, haunting the joint? But she just smirked. We cooked hot dogs, swapped dumb stories from Salem, and I started to unwind. Maybe this wasn't so bad, I thought, cracking a beer and leaning back. First night was calm, almost too calm. Tilda conked out early, sprawled in her sleeping bag, while I stayed up, poking the fire and sipping my brew. The truck sat close, all rugged and reliable, and I kept glancing at it, like it'd haul me back to civilization if I begged. Black Crater loomed up there, barely visible against the moon, and I'll admit, it had a vibe, kinda cool, kinda creepy. I grew up hearing Salem spook stories, old mills, ghost lights, but I'm not the jumpy type. Figured I'd seen worse in a busted carburetor. Then came the jolt. 2 a.m., wide awake, no reason. I sat up, fired down to coals, and listened. Nothing, no wind, no owls, just dead air. Tilda snored softly, oblivious, but my neck hairs were up. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and swept the beam around. Just trees, the truck, the tent flap fluttering a little. Get a grip, Soren, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. Probably just city nerves in the wild. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake that itch, like something was watching from up on that ridge. Morning crept in, cold and foggy. I crawled out of the tent, stiff as hell, while Tilda brewed coffee on the fire. Decent stuff, not my usual gas station swill. She was already plotting a hike to the tower, all chipper and, let's explore. I groaned, sipping my cup, but she had that look, nurse mode, no arguing. The tower peeked through the mist, closer than last night, like it had shifted while we slept. Trick of the light, I told myself. I didn't buy into her ghost crap, but something about this place was starting to gnaw at me, quietly, like a bad vibe under the hood. She dragged me into her plan over breakfast. Hike up, check the view, maybe snap some pics. I nodded, half listening, still stuck on that weird wake-up. The forest felt off, like it was waiting for something. I chalked it up to too much beer and not enough sleep. Tilda tossed me a jacket, grinning like this was the best idea ever. I should have known better, should have stayed in Salem, tinkering with engines. But nah, I'm Soren Elias Voss, too stubborn to back out. Morning in Willamette was a gray, foggy mess, the kind that makes you want to crawl back into bed, or in my case, the truck. I was chugging Tilda's coffee, trying to shake that weird 2 a.m. wake-up, while she bounced around camp, all jazzed about our hike to Black Crater Tower. It's not far, Soren. Just a couple miles, she said, stuffing her backpack with snacks and that grainy photo of Ranger Hagen. I grunted, still half asleep, but she's my sister. Guilt trips are her superpower. So I laced up my boots, grabbed a water bottle, and we headed out, leaving the truck parked like a promise of escape. The trail started off tame, gravel crunching underfoot, pines towering over us, but it didn't stay that way. Tilda led, chattering about how rangers used to haul supplies up here, while I trailed, already regretting this. About a mile in, the path split, one route wide and worn, heading left, the other a skinny, root-choked mess veering right toward the tower. Which way? I asked, eyeing the map she'd printed, some blurry thing off the internet. She squinted at it, then pointed right. This one's quicker. I sighed. Quicker didn't mean better, but arguing with Tilda's like arguing with a brick wall. Big surprise, it sucked. The trail turned into a tangle of brush and rocks, and I kept tripping, my boots snagging every 5 steps. Tilda pushed ahead, all come on, slowpoke, but I was starting to feel it. That quiet again, heavy and wrong. No birds chirping, no breeze, just us and the woods. I stopped to catch my breath, wiping sweat off my forehead, and noticed something. A chunk of metal half buried in the dirt. Old, rusted, like part of a canteen. Hey, check this. I called, kicking it loose. Tilda shrugged. Probably trash. Yeah, but it felt off. Too old, too random. We kept going, the tower's shape poking through the fog now, all jagged and creepy. My legs were burning. Guess fixing engines doesn't prep you for this. And Tilda finally slowed down, pointing up. Almost there, she said, grinning. That's when I heard it. A low buzz, faint but steady, like a bad alternator humming under a hood. I stopped, tilting my head. You hear that? Tilda frowned, listening, then shook her head. Nope. You okay? I nodded, but my gut twisted. It wasn't loud, but it was there, somewhere close, and it was starting to get scary. The trail dumped us at the tower's base, a rickety pile of wood and steel, ladders swaying in the damp air. Tilda wanted to climb, but I wasn't having it. No way. That thing's a death trap, I said, crossing my arms. She pouted, but I pointed at the rungs. Half were rusted through. We compromised. Poke around down here, snap some pics, then head back. She pulled out her phone, clicking away, while I leaned against a rock, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. A mark scratched into the tower's base. Hagen 72. Same guy from her photo. Weird coincidence, I muttered, but it didn't feel like one. Back up, Tilda said, peering out. I threw it in reverse, but before I could move, they came. Those things, pouring from the trees, silent and fast. Dozens of them, ragged, bony, eyes glinting black, closing in like a noose. Soren, Tilda screamed, and I floored it backward, tires spinning, but the road was narrow, and I clipped a pine, hard. Metal crunched, the truck lurched, and we stalled out. The buzz spiked, deafening now, and those freaks were on us, clawing at the hood, the doors. This was life or death. Scary didn't even cut it. I kicked my door open, grabbing Tilda's arm. Out now, we bolted, me dragging her into the woods, my boots slipping on wet needles. They were everywhere, grabbing, reaching, their cold hands brushing my jacket. I swung a fist, connected with something brittle, felt like hitting a dead branch, and it staggered, but more kept coming. Tilda tripped, crying out, and I hauled her up, my lungs burning. Run, Tilda, just run. We zigzagged through the trees, blind in the fog, those things right on our heels, relentless and quiet. We hit a slope, steep, rocky, dropping into darkness. No choice. I shoved Tilda down and followed, sliding, tumbling, rocks tearing at my jeans. We landed hard in a ditch, me on my back, her sprawled beside me, both gasping. The buzz was fainter here, the shapes hovering up top, peering down. I grabbed a busted branch, ready to swing, but they didn't follow, just watched, heads cocked, like they were toying with us. What do they want? Tilda wheezed, clutching her ankle, twisted, maybe broken. Us? I muttered, pulling her behind a log. We crouched there, hearts hammering, as the fog thinned just enough to show a glint. Metal, maybe 100 yards off. A road? A car? I didn't care. It was hope. Come on, I said, looping her arm over my shoulder. She limped, wincing, but we moved, slow and desperate, those things still lurking above. The glint turned out to be an old Ranger truck, rusted, abandoned, keys dangling in the ignition. I shoved Tilda in, jumped behind the wheel, and turned it. It coughed, sputtered, then roared. Hold on, I growled, slamming it into gear. The truck lurched forward, bouncing over roots, those freaks finally moving, rushing down the slope, clawing at the air. I swerved, clipping one, heard a sickening snap, and gunned it harder, the road barely there, but real enough. Tilda screamed as a hand smashed her window, glass cracking, but I didn't stop. The shapes thinned out, falling back, and the buzz dulled, like we'd crossed some line. I kept driving, blood pounding in my ears, until the fog broke and asphalt gleamed ahead. Highway 22. Thank God. We hit the pavement, the truck shaking like it'd collapse, and I didn't let up. Kept it floored towards Salem, or anywhere with lights and people. Tilda was sobbing, clutching her ankle, blood on her cheek from the glass. We're okay, I said, more to myself, but I didn't believe it. Those things let us go. Why? The truck was toast back there, my tools, our gear, all gone. I'd fix anything, but this was beyond me. We'd slipped out of their grip, but I knew deep down they weren't done playing. The Ranger truck rattled down Highway 22, engine groaning like it was on its last legs, while I kept my foot heavy on the gas. Tilda slumped beside me, her ankle swollen and her face streaked with dirt and tears, the cracked window letting in cold air that stung my eyes. We'd slipped those hollow-eyed freaks back in Willamette, their bony hands fading into the fog, but my chest was still tight, like I'd swallowed a rock. The buzz was gone, the road stretching toward Salem, and all I wanted was my garage, my tools, something normal to ground me. But normal was long gone, and I knew it. We rolled into Detroit, a tiny speck of a town. Around midnight, the truck coughing as I pulled into a gas station. Lights buzzed overhead, harsh and real, and I helped Tilda limp inside, her leaning hard on me. The clerk, some old guy with a trucker hat, barely glanced up from his magazine. Rough night, he drawled, ringing up coffee and bandages. You have no idea, I muttered, tossing him cash. We patched her up in the bathroom, ankle braced with gauze, cuts cleaned, and sat there, sipping burnt coffee, trying to process. Those things, the tower, Hagen's mark, it was horror we couldn't shake. Tilda stared at the photo of Hagen, creased and smudged now, her voice shaky. They were Rangers, Soren, stuck there, turned into that. I nodded, rubbing my jaw. Yeah, and we pissed him off. She'd read about Black Crater online, how Rangers went missing, how the tower was abandoned after 72. Guess we'd found out why. We're alive, she said, like it'd fix everything. I wanted to believe her, but my gut screamed we'd left a door open, one that'd swing back on us. I should have stuck to that, called it quits right there. But I didn't. See, the truck was still out there, stranded in the woods with my toolbox, my lifeline. Tilda's ankle was bad, but she begged me not to go back alone. We'll get it towed later, she said, grabbing my arm. I shook her off. It's my rig, Tilda. I can't just leave it. Dumbest call I've ever made, but I'm a mechanic. Tools are my blood. So after dropping her at a motel with strict orders to stay put, I hitched a ride with a logger heading near Willamette, promising myself I'd be quick, grab the truck, get out. Famous last words. I got dropped a mile from camp, sun just up, fog still clinging to the trees. The truck sat there, battered but whole, keys still in my bag inside. I jogged over, heart pounding, and checked it. Gas low, but it'd start. That's when the buzz hit, sharp, angry, vibrating through the ground. I spun around, and they were there, dozens of them, spilling from the woods, faster than before. No slow creep, Just a wall of ragged, hollow rage, eyes locked on me. I dove for the driver's seat, cranked the key, and the engine sputtered. Once, twice, then died. "Come on," I yelled, slamming the dash. They hit the truck like a storm, hands smashing windows, metal groaning as they clawed in. I kicked, swung my flashlight, cracked one in the face, saw it reel, but there were too many. Cold fingers locked around my arms, my legs, yanking me out. I screamed, fought, but they dragged me down, the truck shrinking as they hauled me into the trees. Last thing I saw was Black Crater Tower, stark against the sky, like it had called them to me. Tilda's voice echoed in my head. "We're alive," but I wasn't anymore. Not really. Sheriff found the truck later, empty, trashed, my toolbox scattered. Tilda told him everything, sobbing through it, but they called it a bear attack, closed the case. She's back in Salem now, ankle healing, guilt eating her alive. Me? I'm another ghost story for Willamette, Soren Elias Voss, the idiot who went back. If you're ever near Black Crater, don't stop, don't touch anything. Those rangers don't let go, and I learned that the hard way. Tell Tilda I'm sorry, if you see her. She deserves that much. Tragedy's a bitch, you know? I just wanted my truck, my life. But the forest had other plans. Stay out of Willamette, folks. It's not worth it. The buzz got louder, still faint, but enough to make my teeth itch. I rubbed my jaw, trying to place it, while Tilda rambled about how Hagen probably lived up there, scanning for fires. "Maybe he left that mark," she said, all excited. I wasn't so sure. It looked fresh, edges too sharp for 50 years of weather. I kept it to myself, not wanting to spook her, but my mechanic brain was ticking. Something's off. Soren, check the signs. Then I saw the boot. Old, leather, half-rotted, tucked under a bush nearby. My stomach did a little flip. "Tilda, look at this." She crouched, poking it with a stick. "Gross. Some hiker's junk, probably. Maybe, but it didn't sit right. Too worn, too abandoned." The buzz was steady now, like it was coming from the tower itself, and I caught a flicker up top, something moving behind the cracked windows. "You see that?" I asked, pointing. Tilda squinted, then shook her head. "Fog's playing tricks, Soren." I wasn't convinced, but she was already pacing, ready to head back. My nerves were buzzing worse than the air, and I couldn't shake that boot, or that mark. We started down, Tilda in the lead, me lagging as I kept glancing back. The tower loomed through the mist, like it was daring us to stay longer. I told myself it was nothing. Just an old relic, some leftover junk, my imagination running wild. But that buzz stuck with me, and the forest felt tighter, like it was closing in. Tilda was oblivious, humming some tune from Salem, but I was starting to wonder what the hell we'd walked into. Should have stayed by the truck, tinkering with something safe. So there we were, trudging back down that tangled trail, the fog thickening around us like wet cotton. Tilda was ahead, picking her way through the roots, while I lagged, my eyes darting between the trees and that damn tower fading into the mist. That buzz was still there, low and nagging, like a bad wire shorting out, and it was starting to mess with my head. I kept replaying the boot, the mark, Hagen 72, like puzzle pieces that didn't fit. Tilda called back. "You good, Soren?" I grunted a yeah, but I wasn't. Something was off, way off, and it was about to get scary. We hit the wider trail, maybe a mile from camp, when it happened. A snap, sharp and loud, like a branch breaking under something heavy. We both froze, Tilda whipping around to face me. "What was that?" she whispered, eyes big. I shrugged, playing it cool, but my heart kicked up a gear. "Deer, maybe," I said, scanning the woods. Then it came again, closer, deliberate, from the right. "No deer moves like that." I grabbed her arm, pulling her along. "Let's just keep going." But the air felt wrong now, thick and buzzing, like a storm was brewing inside the forest. Halfway to camp, I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, slipping behind a tree. Not a trick of the fog. This thing moved, fast and quiet, like it didn't want us to clock it. "Tilda," I hissed, nodding toward it. She squinted, then gasped. "What the hell?" Before I could answer, the buzz spiked, loud, rattling my teeth, and a figure stepped out, maybe 50 yards off. Ragged clothes, hunched, face hidden in shadow. Looked like a ranger, but wrong. Too still, too pale. My gut screamed, "Run," but my legs locked up. This was horror movie crap, and we were starring in it. "Tilda, move," I barked, shoving her forward. We bolted, me stumbling over rocks, her panting beside me. The figure didn't chase, just watched, head tilted, like it was sizing us up. Then I heard it. More snaps, all around, left, right, behind. We weren't alone. I risked a glance back. 3, 4, maybe 5 of them, drifting out from the trees, all lanky and twisted, eyes glinting like oil slicks. "Soren, what are they?" Tilda yelped, tripping but catching herself. "I don't know, just go." My voice cracked, panic clawing up my throat. We hit camp hard, me diving for the truck keys in my bag while Tilda spun around, wide-eyed. The fire was dead, the tent sagging, and those things were closing in, slow, steady, like they had all the time in the world. I fumbled the keys, dropping them in the dirt, and cursed loud enough to wake Salem. "Get in," I yelled, snatching them up as Tilda yanked the passenger door open. One of them was closer now, close enough to see its face. Hollow, grinning, like it had been carved out of bone. Disturbing didn't even cover it. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the key in, and cranked the engine. The truck roared awake. Thank God for small favors. And I peeled out, gravel flying, those freaks fading into the fog behind us. Tilda was hyperventilating, clutching the dash. "What were those things, Soren? Rangers? People?" I shook my head, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles bleached. "Not people, not anymore." The buzz was still there, fainter but clinging, like it had burrowed into my skull. I aimed for the main road, praying it'd spit us out somewhere safe. We barreled through the woods, branches scraping the truck, my mind racing faster than the engine. Those things, they weren't random. Hagen's mark, that boot, the tower, it all tied together, and we'd kicked the hornet's nest. Tilda pulled out the photo, hands shaking, and stared at it. "This is crazy," she muttered. I didn't argue. Crazy was an understatement. The fog pressed in, the road twisting, and I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting those hollow faces to pop up. Something was seriously wrong, terrifyingly wrong, and we weren't out of it yet. I floored it, the truck rattling like it'd shake apart, but I didn't care. Camp was history, the tower was behind us, and all I wanted was Salem, Greece, beer, normal life. Tilda kept muttering, we're fine," like a mantra, but I saw the fear in her eyes. Those things didn't chase, but they didn't need to. I could feel them, lingering, waiting. The road stretched on, and I wondered how the hell we'd explain this to anyone. Assuming we made it that far. I had the truck screaming down that dirt road, tires chewing gravel while the fog choked everything around us. My hands were locked on the wheel, sweaty and shaking, and Tilda was pressed against the passenger door, her breath fogging the glass. Those hollow-eyed freaks were out of sight, but I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting them to lunge out of the mist. "Just keep going, Soren," Tilda whispered, like saying it'd make it true. I nodded, jaw tight, flooring it toward what I hoped was Highway 22. We'd escaped camp. Yeah, but this was a horror show now, and I wasn't dumb enough to think we were safe. The road twisted hard, sharper than it should have, and the truck fishtailed, kicking up dirt. I wrestled it back, cursing under my breath, while that buzz hummed through the cab, low and mean. "You hear that?" I asked, voice rough. Tilda nodded, clutching that old photo of Hagen like it'd save us. Then the headlights caught it. A barricade, wooden and splintered, blocking the way. No sign, no detour, just a dead end. My stomach sank. What the hell? I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop, and we sat there, engine idling, fog swirling like it was alive. I can't shake the feeling that coming out here was the biggest mistake of my life. My name is Elijah Warren Pierce. I'm 32 years old, and I grew up in Glendale, Arizona, where I spent most of my time avoiding the scorching desert sun. People back home probably think I'm chasing some epic adventure, driving all the way up to Oregon in my brand new RAV4 just to find myself. Well, let me tell you, if I'd known how downright disturbing this trip would turn, I might have stayed in the comfort of my tiny apartment. You ever get that buzzing dread in the back of your mind, like a quiet whisper telling you that something scary is right around the corner? That's how I felt the moment I crossed the state line. It's weird because I've always been into horror stories, though I mostly keep that part of me hidden. But none of those creepy tales prepared me for the real-life tension creeping into my gut as soon as I saw those dense Oregon forests stretching on like a secret that refuses to be told. I don't know if it's just my nerves or something else entirely, but I swear, the air feels heavier here, almost like it's pressing down on me, reminding me that things are different beyond the open desert. Part of me is excited for the adventure, but another part, the bigger part, regrets it. Big time. I left Glendale right after sunrise, hoping to cover as many miles as I could before the midday heat turned my SUV into a literal oven on wheels. It's funny because I'd always imagined my first real road trip would be something I'd brag about later, telling everyone how I gallantly conquered thousands of miles with a grin on my face. Instead, I felt this knot in my stomach that never loosened, not even when I stopped at a picturesque rest area in Northern California. I still remember the old man with a frayed baseball cap who struck up a conversation at the vending machine, warning me that once I hit Oregon's forests, I should be careful. He didn't say exactly why, just something about folks who wander too far off the trails sometimes never come back. A joke, maybe, but he didn't laugh, and his eyes had that distant look, like he'd seen something horrifying he wasn't ready to share. It definitely planted an uneasy seed in my brain. Have you ever felt that rush of fear? The one that makes your heart skip a beat, even though you can't pinpoint the reason? That's the kind of scary vibe I got from the guy's words. Part of me wanted to ask him more, but another part told me I didn't really want the answers. By the time I reached southern Oregon, the sky had turned charcoal gray with thick clouds that seemed to whisper thunder. I found myself thinking about old horror movies where the storm always rolls in right before something disturbing happens, like the weather itself is part of a twisted plot against you. I joked to myself that maybe I'd soon see a bolt of lightning strike a lone pine tree on the horizon. But no lightning came, just a relentless drizzle that made the roads slick and shiny. I tried blasting the radio to keep my spirits up, flipping through stations until I landed on a local news broadcast. They were discussing a missing hiker incident near one of the historic lookout towers in the Mount Hood National Forest. The host mentioned something about park rangers coordinating a search party, reminding hikers to be extra cautious. The tone was urgent, but not panicked, like this wasn't the first time something weird had happened out there. I couldn't help but wonder if I was heading straight into a place known for unsolved disappearances. Maybe I should have turned around, but curiosity and pride kept me going. After all, I'd come too far to chicken out now, right? I finally arrived at a small town on the outskirts of the Tillamook State Forest, where I planned to camp for a few days. It wasn't exactly tourist season yet, so the motel I stopped at looked almost deserted, save for a couple of trucks in the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed like a dying insect, flickering and casting an eerie glow on the damp pavement. Despite the gloom, I tried to keep my spirits up. I checked in at the front desk, where a board clerk flipped through an old magazine and barely acknowledged me. When I told him I was planning on setting up camp near one of the forest scenic spots, he shrugged and warned me to watch out for bears and cougars. I nodded, though I was more concerned about whatever intangible sense of dread had been trailing me. Still, I forced a grin and asked if there were any park rangers around I could consult for safe camping spots. That's when his eyes flicked up, and for a split second, I swear there was pity in them. He sighed and said something like, "There's a ranger station near the old fire lookout, but they've been busy, a search, I think." Then he cleared his throat, went back to reading, and waved me away. Not exactly reassuring, huh? The next morning, I hopped back into my SUV and headed deeper into the forest. Let me tell you, driving into those thick woods was like stepping into another world. The roads got narrower, the cell reception dropped, and towering evergreens lined the path like silent guardians. If you've ever been somewhere so quiet that your own breathing sounds too loud, you'll know what I mean when I say it felt almost unnatural. I'm used to wide open spaces and scorching sun, but here, the canopy blocked out so much light it felt like twilight at 10 in the morning. My plan was to find the lookout tower that stood on the highest ridge, a spot known for breathtaking views of the surrounding valleys. Supposedly, the place was originally built in the early 1900s to spot wildfires, but it had been restored for modern use. Sounded cool in theory, but as I approached, I noticed the road was partially washed out by recent rains. I parked on a firmer patch and decided to hike the rest of the way. With each step, that unsettling feeling in my gut grew stronger, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. Do you ever get that sense, like you're an intruder in a world that has existed peacefully without you? The lookout tower finally came into view, rising above the treetops like a solitary sentinel. Its wooden beams looked weathered by years of storms, and the metal roof had patches of rust. A small sign near the base indicated that visitors could climb up, but it also said the structure was under the jurisdiction of the local ranger service. Given the missing hiker situation, I figured the tower might be locked or monitored, so I half expected to find a park ranger standing guard. Instead, there was no one. Not a single soul in sight. The wind whipped around, making the steps creak and moan as I climbed. The higher I went, the more the forest below me seemed to blur into a dense, shadowy mass. Part of me felt a thrill. Finally, something worth writing home about. But another part, the part that refuses to ignore the signs, couldn't help thinking. If a search is underway, why isn't there a single ranger here? My mind started throwing out scary scenarios. Maybe they'd found something disturbing and rushed off. Or maybe something had found them. You ever hear a story so chilling that your brain goes into overdrive, conjuring all sorts of worst-case scenarios? That was me, big time. When I reached the top level, I discovered a small cabin-like structure with wide windows offering a panoramic view of the forest. It was breathtaking, sure, but also oddly silent. There was a radio set on a desk, some folding chairs, and a half-empty thermos. The place felt lived in, or at least it had been used recently. I wondered if the ranger who was stationed here had left in a hurry. A faint smell of old coffee lingered in the air, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, like damp wool and burnt wood. It wasn't exactly horrifying, but it gave me goosebumps. Have you ever been in a room where you sense something is off, yet you can't pinpoint why? That's how I felt, rummaging around for any clue about who had been there. I found a notebook with weather logs, sketches of the local trails, and half-finished notes referencing the missing hiker. The last entry was 2 days old, mentioning an area called High Point Ridge. Below it, someone had scribbled, "Do not go alone. Danger." Now, rationally, it could have been a reminder about the perilous terrain or predators. But in that moment, it felt like a direct warning that something truly scary lurked out there. And guess who was here all alone? I'm not gonna lie, I was torn between calling it quits and pressing on. Part of me thought, this is exactly how every horror story starts. But curiosity can be more disturbing than fear itself, because it keeps pushing you forward when you should probably turn back. Besides, I'd come this far, and some twisted sense of pride told me to keep going. I decided I'd explore just a bit longer, maybe find the ranger station and see if they needed a hand. Worst case scenario, I could share any new info I'd found in the lookout tower. I grabbed the notebook, tucked it into my backpack, and tried the radio. It crackled with static, but no voices came through. I remember feeling the wind gusting around the tower, rattling the windows. It made me jump, even though I was trying to act all cool and collected. Before descending the steps, I peered one last time at the endless green below. Have you ever looked at a forest so vast you felt like a tiny speck? It was humbling, but also made me realize how easy it would be to vanish out there without a trace. The missing hiker's face flashed in my mind, someone I'd never met, yet I felt a sudden kinship, like we were connected by this unspoken dread. I climbed down and began tracing a path that wrapped around the ridge, aiming for a spot where I thought the main ranger station might be. The sun peeked out from the clouds just enough to light the trail, but the air still held a certain heaviness, as though everything was on edge. I tried to focus on the crunch of my boots on the damp ground, the smell of pine needles, and the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush. Anything to keep my mind off the nagging tension that had been riding shotgun with me since I got here. Sometimes, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind me. You might be wondering why I didn't just hop back in my SUV and drive away. Trust me, I considered it. But a mixture of stubborn curiosity and a weird sense of responsibility to figure out what was going on anchored me to this place. Maybe I was hoping I could help the park rangers somehow, or at least not run away with my tail between my legs. I couldn't predict that this decision would set me on a path where every next step felt more terrifying than the last. And honestly, I'm not sure if I was being brave or just plain foolish. But that's where my story truly starts. On this narrow trail leading into the unknown, with a missing hiker, an abandoned lookout tower, and a notebook warning me not to go alone. The The trail felt narrower than before, like the trees had shifted in the night just to box me in. That old notebook kept tugging at the edges of my mind, urging me to remember the warning scribbled in a hurried hand. Do not go alone. Danger. It was disturbing how those words seemed to echo with each step. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where someone had set up a shabby campsite. A half-collapsed tent and some scattered belongings hinted at whoever stayed here leaving in a rush. Empty food cans rattled against each other in the soft breeze, and the fire pit was cold to the touch. The whole scene screamed that something had gone wrong, making me question how many more signs I needed before realizing this place wasn't the rustic paradise I'd envisioned. Despite the uneasy vibe, I couldn't turn away. I felt this strong pull to figure out what happened, as if ignoring it would only make things more scary. I took a moment to search through the abandoned gear, hoping to find some kind of clue. Call it nosy or reckless, but I needed answers. Most of the stuff was damp and ruined, but there was a tattered map marked with red circles around various lookout points in the forest. One circle stood out, its ink darker and more aggressive than the others, like someone had pressed down too hard in frustration or fear. That circle was near the area called High Point Ridge, the same place mentioned in the notebook. Have you ever felt that shiver when puzzle pieces fall into place in a horror story and you wish you hadn't noticed? That was me, realizing I was heading right where this poor soul had likely gone. But instead of running back to my SUV, I found my feet rooted to the ground. A disturbing curiosity sparked inside me, like I was auditioning for a doomed role in my own horror movie. As I continued forward, the trees towered overhead, blotting out most of the daylight. It was early afternoon, but it felt like dusk under the dense canopy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. My heartbeat hammered louder than my footsteps, and every snapped twig echoed like a gunshot. I don't know if it was paranoia or something real, but I swear I could sense a presence. This wasn't my first time in the wilderness, but never had I experienced this intense level of dread. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I was just letting horror movie cliches get the better of me. But each time I tried to brush off the tension, it came roaring back, more potent than before. That's when I spotted a few deep scratches etched into the trunk of a pine tree, like claw marks, although I couldn't say if they were from an animal or a knife. Either way, it felt like a warning sign, as if the forest was giving me a message I refused to read. About an hour in, I finally stumbled across a park ranger outpost. It looked more like an oversized shed with a radio antenna, perched between a couple of massive evergreens. Relief flooded through me. I figured this was where I'd find rangers who could offer guidance or at least confirm what the heck was going on out here. But as I got closer, I realized the door was wide open, swaying in the breeze. Inside, it was a mess. Overturned chairs, papers scattered everywhere, and a pungent smell that reminded me of something burnt. The radio equipment was smashed, cables yanked out like someone had been in a hurry to destroy any means of communication. This was more than just a casual break-in. It felt deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, did this wanted to isolate the area. My eyes kept flicking to the corners of the small room, half expecting to find something downright terrifying lurking there. Nothing moved, but that sense of being watched gnawed at my nerves. I found a bulletin board covered with missing person flyers, mostly older cases, but a fresh one caught my eye. A young woman named Kylie, last seen hiking near High Point Ridge. The photo showed her smiling. No clue she'd wind up as another face on a poster. Paper clipped to the flyer was a scribbled note. Search on hold. Lack of resources. It pissed me off to think they'd just stopped looking, especially with the clue I'd found in the lookout tower log. Was it bureaucracy, or was there something more disturbing that forced them to back off? Trying to make sense of it all, I gathered a few pieces of paper with hand-drawn maps and coordinates. The more I read, the more it felt like the rangers suspected some hidden threat, not just typical wild animals or treacherous terrain. One slip of paper read, hikers claim they heard voices at night, but no other campers were reported in the area. My heart did a little flip. Voices in the dark forest? If that's not scary, I don't know what is. I shoved the documents into my pack, thinking I'd find someone else to hand them to, maybe a proper ranger patrol. But the longer I stayed in that trashed outpost, the more I felt like I was breathing in fear itself. Every corner seemed draped in shadows, and the stench of burnt metal clung to my clothes. I couldn't shake the idea that something had intentionally cut off any chance of rescue. Before leaving, I checked a storage closet, hoping to find a radio or a first aid kit. All I found were some battered supplies, like someone had picked through them in desperation. I glanced outside to see if the weather might be turning, and of course, gray clouds were massing in that classic horror movie fashion. A drizzle started, like the forest itself was trying to wash me away, or at least send a message that I wasn't welcome. Still, I headed back out, determined to push on, partly because I felt weirdly responsible, and partly because fleeing seemed pointless if this danger was everywhere. The trail angled upward, guiding me toward High Point Ridge. Occasionally, I'd pass signs with warnings like "keep to designated paths," which in normal circumstances I'd ignore as standard advice. But now they felt like urgent pleas. Don't wander off unless you want something terrifying to find you. The forest grew denser, and the undergrowth tangled around my feet. My mind whirled with worst-case scenarios. Maybe that missing hiker got lost, or maybe something actually took her. Rationally, I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Maybe she fell into a ravine or got disoriented. But that wouldn't explain the destroyed radio station or the sinister mood that seemed to hang in the air. Funny how a place can be so beautiful yet so threatening at the same time. If you've ever felt both awe and dread simultaneously, you get what I'm saying. I spotted another clue near a large boulder. A dropped water bottle with the same logo I'd seen in the outpost photos next to Kylie's name. It was half buried in the mud, suggesting it had been there for a few days. Kneeling down, I picked it up and felt a wave of sadness, picturing her losing grip of it while running for her life, or maybe just trying to call for help. The scariest part was that the forest felt so silent. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves beyond the occasional wind. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Something about that silence made every small sound, my heartbeat, my footsteps, the faint rustle of my jacket, seem monstrously loud. I glanced over my shoulder again, convinced for a moment I saw a shape dart behind a tree. Could have been my imagination, but my pulse shot through the roof, all the same. This was no casual camping trip. This was stepping headlong into a horror scenario I never signed up for. As the light faded, I knew I needed to make camp soon, but the idea of sleeping out here felt downright disturbing. Still, my legs ached, and I wasn't about to hike these trails in total darkness. I found a spot slightly elevated from the path, near a formation of rocks that could at least provide a windbreak. Setting up my small tent with trembling hands, I kept pausing to listen for any unusual sound. The only noise was the soft patter of rain on leaves and my own ragged breathing. I tried to calm myself by focusing on practical tasks, laying out my sleeping bag, checking my flashlight batteries, making sure I had enough water. Yet a heaviness weighed on my chest, like the forest was pressing in on me from every side. In the pit of my stomach, I felt the nagging realization I might not be safe here, not in the slightest. But pushing on in the dark seemed even more reckless. All I could do was stay alert, hunker down, and hope daylight might bring some answers or at least a hint of a ranger patrol. I slipped inside my tent, zipped it up tight, and realized how paper-thin that nylon barrier truly is. It offered zero real protection if something or someone decided to pay me an unwelcome visit. Exhaustion swept over me, but sleep was a joke with my nerves shot and adrenaline pumping. I kept replaying the events of the day, the abandoned lookout tower, the destroyed ranger outpost, the cryptic notebook entries. My mind churned with questions. What if the missing people had stumbled onto something no one was supposed to see? Or maybe a deranged local was stalking campers. The scariest part is not knowing what you're up against. It leaves room for your imagination to fill the blanks with every horror scenario you've ever heard. I tried to reassure myself that come morning, I'd make more progress. Little did I know, this was just the first taste of what lay ahead, and my problems were only beginning to unfold. I woke up in a panic to a low, distant rumbling, like something heavy moving through the forest. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might bust out of my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, half expecting to see a huge silhouette outside my tent, but all I saw were the gently swaying branches. I couldn't tell if the noise had come from an animal, the weather, or something far more disturbing. The air felt unnaturally cold, and a thin mist clung to the ground like a blanket of ghostly vapor. I don't mind telling you I was downright spooked. Back home, I'd roll my eyes at so-called horror stories about bizarre nighttime sounds. But out here, every tiny rustle felt magnified 1,000 times. My instincts told me to pack up and bolt, but a stronger pull, maybe curiosity or pure stubbornness, kept me rooted. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't outrun your own fear, no matter how scary it gets. I forced myself to step outside the tent, shining my flashlight in slow arcs. Mist swirled through the beam, revealing nothing but wet leaves and silent trees. Still, my gut screamed that I wasn't alone, like I was being watched from just beyond the light. It reminded me of that feeling you get in a pitch-black room, convinced there's a lurking figure you can almost see out of the corner of your eye. It's weird how powerful the mind can be, especially when you're already on edge. I tried to shrug it off, told myself it was probably just the wind or maybe a deer stumbling around in the undergrowth. But each time I tried to rationalize it, I'd hear another faint noise, a twig snap, a strange hush of movement. It felt like the forest itself was alive, teasing me with glimpses of something terrifying behind the curtain. Eventually, I gathered the nerve to pack up camp. Dawn was still a few hours off, but sitting around in that flimsy tent was worse than pressing forward. With the tent stuffed clumsily into my backpack, I set out along the trail again, guided mostly by my flashlight and a vague memory of the map I'd seen. As I hiked, I noticed the forest canopy opening up, allowing faint moonlight to filter through. That gave me some sense of relief, until I spotted shapes in the distance. Rocks, logs, or maybe something else entirely. Paranoia kept me jumping at every shadow. There's a thin line between staying alert and letting fear consume you. And let me tell you, I was starting to blur that line. Each step felt like an invitation for whatever horror might be out there to reveal itself. A couple of miles in, I reached a natural overlook where the ground dipped into a valley. The moonlight was just bright enough to show me the rolling expanse of forest below, dotted with pockets of fog. It was both beautiful and scary, a stark reminder of how tiny I was in this massive landscape. It hit me that if people really were going missing out here, finding them would be like searching for a needle in a stack of needles. The swirling mist made it hard to see too far, but I caught sight of a faint glow at the valley's edge. My first thought was maybe a ranger's flashlight or a campfire. Desperate for human contact, I decided to head that way, hoping I'd find help, or at least someone who could share the burden of this disturbing predicament. The trek down into the valley was treacherous. Rocks shifted under my boots, sending miniature landslides of gravel tumbling into the darkness. More than once, I had to grab onto tree roots to keep from slipping. Part of me kept replaying the ominous warnings in that notebook. Do not go alone. Danger. Here I was, very much alone, stumbling through a forest that seemed determined to swallow me whole. About halfway down, I paused to catch my breath and realized the glow I'd seen had vanished. The valley looked pitch black again, except for the occasional glint of moonlight on wet foliage. Did I imagine that light, or did whoever was out there extinguish it? Either way, I felt a surge of dread knowing I might have lost my only lead to a possible ally. At last, I made it to level ground. The air was heavy and damp, and every breath tasted like moss and earth. The trail was less defined here, and I soon found myself weaving between ancient trees, their roots twisting across the ground like giant serpents. That's when I spotted a signpost, half-rotted but still legible enough to read, High Point Ridge, 1.2 miles. Relief and anxiety flooded me in equal measure. I was close to the infamous ridge mentioned in the log. Maybe I'd find more clues about the missing hiker, or maybe I'd find something that would make me regret coming this far. My heartbeat soared as I stared at the weathered sign, realizing that in a horror movie, this would be the point of no return. Just then, I heard a muffled cry echo through the trees, like a voice calling out for help, but so faint I couldn't tell the direction. Have you ever heard something so startling that your pulse drops and your limbs go numb? That was me, frozen in place, unsure if it was a real person or some trick of my imagination. But then it came again, slightly louder, definitely human. Fear and adrenaline collided, propelling me forward. I didn't stop to think about the risk of running straight into a trap. If someone needed help, I couldn't just ignore them. Trudging through brambles and sloshing through patches of mud, I followed the cries until they faded into silence, leaving me breathless and alone in a tiny clearing. No sign of another person, just a battered backpack lying by a fallen log. It looked vaguely familiar, like something I'd seen in one of the photos at the ranger outpost. I unzipped the pack with shaking fingers, discovering more personal belongings. A wallet with an ID for someone named James, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a nearly empty notebook with frantic, half-legible notes about sightings of figures in the distance and noises after midnight. The tone was panicked, the handwriting jagged. My stomach twisted as I tried to piece together the timeline. Was James the missing hiker, or did he come searching for someone else? The idea that multiple people had ended up lost, driven to paranoia by this place, started to feel all too real. And yet, no matter how disturbing it got, I couldn't shake the compulsion to dig deeper, to find some explanation for why so many had vanished under these colossal trees. A rustle snapped me out of my thoughts. I leapt to my feet, shining my flashlight around. Something moved in the underbrush, quick and low to the ground. My heart thudded in my chest, so hard I wondered if it might alert whatever was there. The beam caught a glimpse of ragged clothing, or maybe fur. It was too fast to tell. Then it was gone, leaving me with my imagination spiraling into every dark corner possible. I realized my breathing had become shallow, and I forced myself to take a slow inhale. Despite the surge of terror, I decided to push on, hoping to find the source of that cry for help, or at least a safe place to gather my thoughts. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was flirting with disaster, but what choice did I have? Every path seemed equally scary, and turning back felt like surrendering to the unknown. So I chose to move forward, deeper into the darkness, praying I wouldn't stumble onto something that would make all those horror stories I'd ever heard seem like child's play. I scrambled through the thick underbrush, heart hammering so loud it felt like it might burst. The darkness pressed in from every side, as if the forest were alive and trying to swallow me whole. Branches whipped at my arms, and my boots sank into patches of slick mud, but I was too panicked to care. Ever since I heard that desperate cry for help vanish into thin air, fear had become my driving force. A single thought kept running through my head: get away, get out, survive. It was like I'd crossed an invisible threshold where logic no longer mattered, only raw instinct. My flashlight flickered once, and I nearly lost it, picturing the bulb dying at the worst possible time. The beam held steady, though, illuminating a trail that wound upward. Even in my frenzy, I recognized part of the path leading back toward higher ground. If I could just climb out of this fog-choked valley, maybe I'd stand a better chance of escape. My lungs burned with each frantic step, but I pushed harder. I knew staying put was like signing my own death warrant. The scattered clues, the ruined ranger station, the cryptic warnings in that notebook, the glimpses of something moving just out of sight, had all led me here. And now I was done playing detective. The seriousness of the situation finally hit me like a punch to the gut. Something or someone out here was hunting, and I had no intention of being the next horror story. Ahead, the trail curved sharply, forcing me to slow my pace. That's when I caught wind of a foul smell wafting through the damp air. It was rotten, metallic, and so overpowering it made me gag. I've never experienced a scent that strong in nature, and it triggered an almost primal fear, like I'd stumbled into a forbidden place drenched in terror. I forced my way around the bend, hoping the stench would fade, but it only grew more intense. Even the breeze felt heavier, carrying a sticky warmth that shouldn't have existed in the cool forest night. My flashlight revealed a partial clearing ahead, the ground littered with broken branches and patches of matted grass. At first, I thought it might be a campsite. Maybe someone tried to set up a shelter here. But as I edged closer, nausea twisted my stomach. The area was strewn with remnants of something violent. Torn fabric, scattered gear, and a deep stain in the dirt that I didn't need a forensic team to identify. My legs shook so badly I had to brace myself against a tree. Fear pounded inside my skull, screaming at me to turn and run. But a bizarre mix of horror and pity kept me staring. Could this have been James, or maybe the original missing hiker, Kylie? Or was it someone else entirely? My mind reeled with the disturbing possibility that more than one life had ended here. A sudden rustling broke my paralysis. Without thinking, I killed the flashlight and ducked behind the trunk of an ancient cedar, pressing my back to the rough bark. My breath caught in my throat, and I barely dared to peek around. I couldn't see anything through the darkness except vague shapes swaying in the breeze. The rustling became faint footfalls, or maybe pawfalls. They moved erratically, shuffling through leaves and brush. It didn't sound like a casual stroll, but more like a purposeful approach, someone or something that knew exactly where it was going. In that moment, the terror I felt was so real it almost numbed me. Time seemed to slow, every heartbeat a countdown I couldn't afford to let reach zero. I prayed that whatever it was wouldn't notice me crouched there like a trapped animal. One wrong move, and I was sure my story would end in this gruesome clearing, just another casualty of the forest. Seconds ticked by like hours until the footsteps drifted away, melting into the background of shifting branches. My legs were jelly, and I struggled to stay upright. Deciding it was now or never, I activated the flashlight again, shielding it partially with my hand to avoid drawing attention, and crept back toward the path. Every neuron in my body screamed to run, but I kept my pace steady, calculating that a sudden burst of motion might give me away. Each step away from that clearing felt like an escape from a nightmare, though I knew I wasn't safe by any stretch of the imagination. The forest around me remained a tomb of silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. If a life-or-death chase was about to begin, I didn't want to be at a dead stop when it did. I reached an incline where the undergrowth thinned out, giving me some breathing room. Thunder grumbled in the distance, and the first few drops of rain started to fall. Great. Another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. The slick ground became even more treacherous, each step threatening to pitch me forward onto my face. But maybe the rain could work in my favor, masking my movements and washing away my trail. I tried to cling to that optimistic thought, needing any glimmer of hope. After all, if whoever or whatever was behind this terror had a keen sense of direction, the rain might be the distraction I needed to slip away. The wind picked up, whipping branches overhead into a restless clatter, as if the forest itself was urging me to keep moving. Lightning flashed in the distance, and for a split second, the entire forest lit up with a ghostly glow. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A tall, lean figure off to my right, partially concealed behind a stand of pines. I couldn't make out details, just the silhouette of long limbs and a slight tilt of the head, as if it was staring straight at me. The flash ended, darkness returning with a vengeance. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my fight-or-flight reflex kicked in hard. This wasn't just a lost hiker or a curious ranger. Whatever stood there was observing me with an almost predatory stillness, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself not to scream. Instead, I turned and bolted up the incline, branches snapping underfoot. If the figure followed, I had no way of knowing, but I felt its presence bearing down on my back like a physical weight. I crested a ridge overlooking the forest canopy, my heart punching against my ribcage. Rain whipped against my face, and the wind howled, carrying an undertone that sounded almost like laughter. Far below, I glimpsed the faint outline of a winding road. Relief flooded me at the thought of reaching my SUV, of tearing out of this nightmare and never looking back. Sure, that meant leaving behind any hope of solving the mystery of the missing people, but right then, my own survival came first. I scrambled down the slope, slipping and sliding, cursing under my breath every time I nearly lost my footing. In the dark and stormy chaos, it was easy to imagine the figure closing in, stretching out a long arm to yank me down. The thought pushed me onward, faster than I ever thought I could move. My SUV came into view, parked just where I'd left it near that partially washed-out road. Relief blasted through me like a shockwave. I had actually made it back, though my bones felt like they'd been rattled loose. I fumbled the keys from my pocket, hard in my throat. It took 3 shaky tries before I could unlock the door. The engine roared to life, headlights slicing through the night. For a heartbeat, I expected to see that terrifying silhouette emerge from the trees, but all I saw was rain and swirling fog. It was enough. Jamming the vehicle into gear, I stomped on the gas, tires spinning in the mud before finally catching traction. As I sped away, adrenaline surged, making the nightmarish forest blur by in a haze of wet branches and lightning flashes. Maybe it was my imagination, but I thought I caught a final glimpse in the rearview mirror, a slender shape standing at the tree line, staring with an intensity that burned into my mind. I drove faster. Windshield wipers slapped back and forth, struggling against the downpour. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, but I couldn't let go. Each hairpin turn on the soaked forest road was a gamble, but stopping wasn't an option. This was no longer an ordinary camping trip gone wrong. It was a life-or-death flight from an unseen terror that seemed perfectly at home in these woods. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my chest felt like it was on fire. But I had to keep going, had to escape. A small voice in my head asked if I'd ever feel truly safe again, or if this horror would follow me, haunting every shadow for the rest of my life. Right then, I didn't have the luxury of pondering answers. All I could do was keep my foot on the pedal and pray the forest would release its hold on me before I lost control, either of the SUV or my own sanity. I sped down the forest road, hands clenched on the steering wheel so tight they felt glued there. Even though the headlights pierced the darkness, every shift of a tree branch seemed like a potential ambush. My mind raced with everything I'd witnessed: the shredded campsite, that grotesque smell, the figure lingering in the trees. Rain pelted the windshield in thick sheets, forcing me to squint just to see the winding road. Part of me wanted to believe I'd left the nightmare behind, but a deeper part knew horror had already sunk its claws into me. The forest might be fading in my rearview mirror, but the memory of it wasn't about to disappear. At least I was alive, or so I kept telling myself, my heart jackhammering with a terror that refused to die down. I must have driven miles without easing off the gas. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and I couldn't tell if it was the storm or my own adrenaline making everything shake. Eventually, the muddy road merged onto a battered two-lane highway, a sign of civilization. Relief almost made me collapse against the steering wheel. I spotted a faint light in the distance, maybe a gas station or a roadside diner. The thought of other human beings felt downright heavenly. I pressed the pedal harder, as if escaping the forest entirely would erase the disturbing images lodged in my brain. But behind the relief lurked a creeping worry. Was whatever haunted those woods truly stuck there, or had I carried that terror with me like a curse? Sure enough, it was a rundown gas station, the neon open sign flickering like it hadn't been serviced in years. I pulled in under the fluorescent glow of a single overhead lamp, which cast harsh shadows across the SUV's hood. Cutting the engine, I realized my hands were trembling. I just sat there for a moment, soaking in the mundane sight of a nearly empty parking lot. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped out of one world and into another. A single pump island stood crooked, and the store's windows were plastered with faded posters for cheap beer and lottery tickets. Compared to the sinister quiet of the forest, it was practically a beacon of safety. I forced myself to breathe slow and steady, ignoring the urge to keep driving until I hit Glendale, Arizona, or anywhere else far from Oregon's dark corners. I needed answers, or at least a chance to warn someone about that place. Gathering my courage, I pried my hands from the wheel and stepped outside. Rain drummed on the station's overhang, creating a dull roar that almost drowned out my own thoughts. Inside, a tired-looking clerk stood behind the counter, watching something on a tiny TV. He glanced up when I entered, expression shifting to concern as he took in my drenched clothes and wild-eyed look. Without waiting for him to speak, I blurted out a frantic summary of what had happened. Missing hikers, a destroyed ranger station, something terrifying in the woods. For a second, I expected him to laugh me off as some paranoid tourist. Instead, his face went pale. He switched off the TV and asked if I was hurt, if I needed the police or an ambulance. I nodded, relief mingling with a fresh wave of exhaustion. Maybe now I'd find some help. While the clerk fiddled with an ancient landline phone, complaining the line was static-filled but still working, I paced around the small shop. Shelves stocked with candy bars, canned soup, and cheap souvenirs reminded me just how normal life could be outside those haunted trees. It felt almost comical that I'd just come from a living nightmare, only to be surrounded by mundane items like beef jerky and potato chips. Yet my pulse refused to settle, my instincts still screaming that the horror wasn't over. The clerk finally managed to get through to the local sheriff's office, explaining in hushed tones that a traveler had stumbled onto something awful in the forest. Even as he spoke, a crackle of thunder rattled the glass door, and I couldn't help flinching at the storm's intensity. Minutes later, an older deputy arrived, the lines on his face etched deep like he'd seen more than he cared to talk about. He stepped out of his patrol car, water running off his brimmed hat as he hustled inside. I began recounting the details for the third time that night, voice quavering with a disturbing mix of fear and relief. The deputy nodded, scribbling notes, occasionally shooting me a searching look. I handed over the scattered documents I'd collected, a crumpled missing person flyer, a page of those cryptic warnings. He frowned at the mention of the rumored figure lurking in the shadows, then asked if I'd be willing to lead a search team back there. My stomach dropped at the thought of returning to that place, but I also felt this crushing guilt. People were missing, and I'd seen signs that something tragic had already happened. Maybe I was the only one who could point them in the right direction. Exhausted but resolute, I finally agreed. The deputy thanked me, radioed for backup, and suggested I grab something to eat before we headed out. That's when I noticed a worn corkboard near the restrooms, plastered with local newspaper clippings. One article headline stood out like a flashing warning sign. Unexplained disappearances plague Oregon's historic lookouts. My heart clenched. This wasn't a one-off incident. Whatever was going on had been happening for years. Details in the article sounded eerily similar to my own experience. Search parties that went missing themselves, cryptic sightings of tall shapes in the woods. It ended with a quote from a long-retired ranger. "If you see something you can't explain out there, don't go looking for answers." A chill ran down my spine, reinforcing just how dangerous our plan was. Before I could lose my nerve, a couple more deputies arrived, forming a small convoy. They seemed confident, almost casual, like this was just another day on the job. I wanted to warn them about how scary it was in those trees, about the unspeakable sense of dread that clings to you like a second skin. But I swallowed my words. They wouldn't truly understand until they felt it themselves. We set out, me driving behind 2 squad cars, headlights cutting through the relentless rain. Even with law enforcement by my side, I felt that old dread creeping back. It was one thing to flee the woods. It was another to march straight into them, fully aware of how tragic things could get. A phrase from the article hovered in my mind. "Whatever you do, don't look for answers." We reached the forest boundary as the storm raged on, wind lashing the vehicles and making it difficult to even open the doors. The deputies spread out in a tight formation, radios crackling with clipped exchanges. I showed them the road leading to where I'd parked before. I had to force my shaking legs to move, guiding them down the same path I'd once prayed I'd never see again. Lightning illuminated the treetops, revealing twisted branches that looked almost sentient in the strobe-like flashes. My voice trembled as I explained, step by step, where I'd discovered the blood-stained clearing. We were treading on haunted ground, and every cell in my body screamed that it would be a deadly mistake to keep going. But the momentum of the group pulled me forward, and I had no choice but to follow. About halfway to the clearing, a deputy in the lead shouted something into his radio, but the storm drowned out his words. He took a few more steps, then vanished into the darkness with a startled yell. We rushed forward, flashlights stabbing through the rain, but there was no sign of him, no footprints in the mud. The group fanned out, searching, calling his name. Panic hit me like a sledgehammer. It was happening again, like the forest was hungry for more. In the midst of the confusion, I realized I stood perilously close to the spot where I'd seen the disturbing remnants earlier. Lightning lit up the scene just in time for me to glimpse a shape slipping between the trees. A tall, lean form, watching. And in that frozen second, I understood, some tragedies don't need a reason. They just happen, fueled by a horror older than we can comprehend, thriving on our mistakes and fear. I never should have taken this shift. The moment I pulled my forest green RAV4 up the winding mountain road, something felt off. My name is Evelyn Marie Hartley, 32 years old, a park ranger who transferred from a quiet district in Montana to the dense, shadowy forests of the Oregon Cascades. The lookout tower loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of weathered wood and rusted metal, perched like a predator against the slate-gray sky. My hands were still shaking from the drive up. Not from the treacherous mountain road, but from something deeper, a sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since I'd accepted this seasonal position. The forest seemed to breathe around me, dense pine trees pressing close, their branches like grasping fingers reaching toward my vehicle. I'd heard stories from the older rangers, whispered tales that most dismissed as campfire nonsense. But something in their eyes always made me wonder. The tower had been used for wildfire detection for decades, but recent budget cuts meant fewer rangers, longer shifts, and more isolated posts. My predecessors had spoken about the loneliness, the way the silence could play tricks on your mind. But this was more than loneliness. This was something darker, something that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of the forest floor, waiting. I remembered the briefing from my supervisor, Tom, a grizzled veteran who'd seen more forest fires than most. "Stay alert," he'd said, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "These mountains, they've got stories." At the time, I'd chalked it up to the typical rural mysticism, but now, standing beside my RAV-4 with the tower casting its long shadow, I understood there was something more sinister lurking. The radio on my belt crackled occasionally, a reminder that communication was tenuous up here. Spotty cell service, limited radio range, and miles of dense forest in every direction. I was essentially alone, an isolated sentinel watching over a landscape that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The watchtower creaked, a sound that seemed too deliberate to be just wind and old timber. My gear was minimal: a first aid kit, emergency supplies, binoculars, and a logbook. Standard issue for a ranger, but suddenly it felt woefully inadequate. The forest around me wasn't just a landscape. It felt like a living, watching entity. Each rustle of leaves, each distant bird call seemed calculated, deliberate. Something was watching me, and it wasn't just the usual wildlife. The tower's windows were grimy, reflecting fragments of the surrounding forest like broken mirrors. Some panes were cracked, others had been patched with makeshift repairs. It looked like it had seen things, witnessed events that no official report would ever document. Stories etched into its wooden frame, stories that whispered of something more than just wind and weather. As I grabbed my backpack and approached the tower, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't going to be a typical ranger shift. Something was waiting for me, something that had been patient, calculating, and hungry. The forest seemed to lean in closer, watching, waiting, and I was about to find out exactly what secrets these mountains had been keeping. The interior of the lookout tower was nothing like I expected. Sure, I'd seen old fire detection stations before, but this place felt different. Layers of dust covered everything, but not the kind that suggested simple abandonment. This was a thick, almost deliberate coating, like something had been carefully preserving the space, keeping it frozen in time. My first task was to do a complete inventory and systems check. The radio equipment looked ancient, with dials and switches that seemed more suited to a museum than an active ranger station. When I flipped the main power switch, something flickered, not just the lights, but something else. A shadow? A movement just at the edge of my vision that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. I found an old logbook tucked away in a drawer. Most entries were routine: weather conditions, visibility reports, occasional wildlife sightings. But towards the back, the handwriting changed, became erratic, desperate. The last few entries were almost illegible, with phrases like "something watching" and "not alone" scrawled in increasingly shaky script. I told myself it was probably just stress from a long, isolated shift. The tower's windows provided a panoramic view of the surrounding forest, but something was off. The landscape seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at it. Trees that had been in one position would appear slightly different when I glanced back. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadow, but the feeling grew, a sense that the forest was alive, watching, calculating. My radio crackled intermittently. Most of the time it was just static, but occasionally, just for a split second, I could swear I heard something. Not words exactly, more like a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. Each time I tried to adjust the frequency, the sound would vanish. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped significantly. Not the gradual cooling you'd expect in the mountains, but a sudden, sharp plunge that seemed to drain the warmth from the tower itself. I checked the thermometer. It was reading temperatures that didn't make sense. One moment it would show 50 degrees, the next 20, then back again, as if the very physics of the space were unstable. I tried calling the ranger station for a routine check-in. The phone line was dead, not just no signal, but completely silent. No dial tone, no static, just absolute, complete silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. That's when I noticed the first real sign that something was terribly wrong. A set of scratches on the tower's wooden floor. Fresh scratches. Deep. Unlike anything made by an animal. Something was here with me. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. And it was getting closer. Night fell faster than it should have. One moment, there was a dim, filtered light through the tower's windows. The next, total darkness. Not the natural darkness of a forest, but a thickness that seemed to consume everything. The scratches on the floor were no longer just marks. They were moving. Slowly. Deliberately. Tracing patterns that looked almost like a map. But a map of what? I couldn't tell. The first real sound came around midnight. A soft tapping. Not from outside, but inside the tower. Tap. 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 Rhythmic. Intelligent. Something was testing the walls, probing for weakness. I'd been trained to remain calm in wilderness emergencies. But this was beyond any training. This was something primal, something that spoke to the deepest parts of human fear. My flashlight began to flicker, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The old equipment around me, radio dials, maps, communication devices, started to shift. Not dramatically, but just enough to make me question my sanity. A compass needle spun wildly. A weathered map on the wall seemed to breathe, its edges rippling like something was trying to push through from behind. I found the first trace of blood around 2 a.m. Just a small droplet on the wooden floor near the scratched patterns. It wasn't animal blood. Too dark, too thick, and it was still warm. Whatever was in the tower with me wasn't just a presence. It was hunting, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tower itself seemed to be transforming. Wooden beams that had looked solid hours earlier now appeared rotted, with strange organic growth spreading between the planks. Fungal? Something else? The walls seemed to pulse with a sick, internal rhythm, like a heartbeat just beyond human perception. My radio suddenly burst to life. Not with static, but with a voice. Distorted. Familiar. It sounded like the last ranger who'd worked this station, the one whose desperate log entries I'd read earlier. "Don't look," the voice whispered. "Don't turn around." But curiosity is a terrible, fatal human weakness. When I turned, something was there. Not fully formed. Not completely human. A shape composed of forest shadows, of twisted branches, and something darker. Something that remembered being human once, but had long since become something else. Something hungry. The thing smiled. And I knew my survival was no longer guaranteed. Survival instinct is a powerful thing. One moment I was frozen in terror, the next I was moving. The creature, if you could call it that, moved differently. Not like a predator, but like something that understood space and time differently. It flickered, shifted, existed in multiple places at once. I grabbed my emergency pack and made a split-second decision. The tower's stairs. My only chance. Each step was a battle against something that seemed to be manipulating the very structure of the building. Wooden planks rotted beneath my feet the moment I touched them. The walls oozed a dark, viscous substance that wasn't quite blood, wasn't quite anything I could name. My SUV was my only hope. If I could reach it, if I could start the engine, maybe, just maybe, I could escape. But the forest was no longer just a landscape. It was a living barrier, branches twisting to block my path, roots rising to trip me, shadows moving with predatory intent. The creature followed. Not chasing exactly, more like herding, guiding me exactly where it wanted me to go. I could feel its presence even when I couldn't see it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, a weight just beyond perception. Each step was a negotiation with something that understood terror as a language. My radio crackled again. This time, multiple voices. Previous rangers. Victims. A chorus of whispered warnings, fragments of stories that hinted at something ancient living in these mountains. Something that used the lookout towers as hunting blinds. Something that had been collecting stories, collecting souls, for generations. The forest floor seemed to come alive. Not with animals, but with something else. Shadows that moved with purpose. Roots that reached like grasping fingers. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural blurred with every step I took. When I finally reached my SUV, I knew something was wrong. The vehicle wasn't just a machine anymore. It was another trap. Another layer in whatever game was being played. The engine turned over, but something else was turning with it. Something was coming with me, regardless of whether I wanted it to or not. Dawn broke, but not like any dawn I'd ever seen. The light was wrong. Filtered. Diseased. My SUV was miles down the mountain road, but I knew I hadn't truly escaped. The forest was still with me. The creature was still with me. I realized then that this wasn't about survival. This was about something much older. A ritual. A selection. The previous rangers hadn't disappeared. They'd been chosen. Transformed. And now, it was my turn. My phone finally had signal. But the message wasn't from anyone I knew. A text from a number that didn't exist. Welcome home. The photographs in my camera roll had changed. Images of the tower. Of the forest. But not as they were. As they had been. Decades ago. With figures standing in windows. Watching. The medical report would later say I was found in perfect health. No signs of trauma. No evidence of what I'd experienced. Just another ranger with a story too impossible to believe. But I knew the truth. The forest knew the truth. Some places are not meant to be watched. Some stories are not meant to be told. And some hunters are very, very patient. I never thought a simple hiking permit would lead me here. My F-150 bounced along the isolated mountain road, kicking up dust that seemed to swallow the surrounding forest like a hungry ghost. I'm Marcus Everett Reyes, 35, an environmental consultant from Seattle who'd taken this contract to survey remote trail conditions in the Willamette National Forest. If only I'd known what was waiting. The forest felt different from the moment I arrived. Not just the usual wilderness. This was something else. Dense pine forests pressed against the road, so thick they seemed to breathe, to pulse with something more than just natural life. My research had brought me to some of the most isolated areas of Oregon, but this place felt different. Charged. Waiting. My work typically involved environmental impact assessments, mapping trail conditions, checking for erosion and wildlife patterns. But something about this particular assignment felt off from the beginning. My contact at the Forest Service had been unusually vague. Just do a standard survey, they'd said, their voice tight, eyes avoiding mine. Now, driving deeper into the forest, those words echoed with a sinister undertone. The F-150 was my lifeline out here, a reliable beast that had carried me through countless remote locations. But today it felt small, insignificant. The truck's engine seemed to struggle, not from mechanical issues, but from something less tangible, as if the forest itself was pushing back, resisting my intrusion into its domain. I'd heard stories about these forests, local legends whispered among park rangers and longtime residents, tales of hikers who'd vanished without a trace, of trails that seemed to shift and change, of something ancient that watched from between the trees. I'd always dismissed them as campfire nonsense. Professional skepticism, my colleagues would call it. Now, I wasn't so sure. My GPS was useless out here. The signal kept cutting in and out, showing impossible routes, terrain that didn't match any map. Twice now, I'd seen waypoints appear and disappear, trails that existed one moment and were gone the next. Just tricks of the light, I told myself. But the lie felt hollow even as I thought it. The research station where I was meant to check in looked abandoned. Not just empty, abandoned in a way that suggested a sudden, violent departure. Papers scattered, a coffee mug overturned, a chair tipped as if someone had left in a hurry. The kind of scene that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, that whispers of something more than a simple workplace exodus. As I parked the truck and grabbed my gear, I realized I was being watched. Not by anything I could see, not by any animal or human, but by something else. Something that existed in the spaces between the trees, in the shadows that didn't quite move right, in the silence that was just a little too perfect. My survey had just become something else entirely, and I was no longer sure who, or what, was really conducting the research. The research station's interior was a maze of contradictions. Professional equipment lay scattered alongside personal items that seemed deliberately placed. A family photo turned face down, a coffee mug with a lipstick mark, a half-written report that trailed off into illegible scribbles. Something had interrupted whatever work was happening here, and the abruptness felt deliberate. My first task was to review the existing trail maps and survey notes. But nothing made sense. The topographical data seemed to shift each time I looked at it. Trails that were marked as clear showed impossible terrain in the photographs. GPS coordinates didn't align with physical landmarks. It was as if the forest itself was playing a complex game of misdirection. The radio equipment caught my attention next. Most of the communication devices were functional, but something felt off. Occasional burst of static carried fragments of sound. Not quite words, not quite noise. Just enough to make me question whether I'd actually heard anything at all. The kind of audio trick that makes you doubt your own senses. I found a series of field journals in a locked drawer. The locks weren't damaged, but they opened with an unsettling ease, as if they wanted to be discovered. The entries started professionally, standard survey notes, wildlife observations, trail conditions, but they gradually devolved into something else. Paranoid observations, notes about something watching, something that wasn't supposed to be here. The last entry, dated just 3 weeks ago, was particularly disturbing. The handwriting had become erratic, pressed so hard into the page that it tore through the paper in places. It's not just watching, the text read. It's selecting. We're not studying the forest. The forest is studying us. The words were underlined multiple times, with desperate, frantic energy. Outside, the forest seemed to press closer to the station's windows. Trees that should have been stationary appeared to have shifted position. Branches that looked bare moments ago now seemed laden with something. Not leaves, not fruit, but something else. Something that washed with an intelligence far beyond natural vegetation. My equipment began to malfunction in subtle ways. The digital camera would capture images that didn't match what I was seeing. GPS devices would show impossible routes. Even my satellite phone seemed to pulse with a strange energy, displaying fragments of messages that made no sense, coordinates that didn't exist, timestamps from years in the future. As night began to fall, I realized I wasn't alone in the research station. Something was here with me. Not a sound exactly, not a movement, but a presence. A weight of something watching, calculating, waiting. And I knew my simple survey had just become something far more dangerous. Darkness fell like a blade. One moment there was fading light. The next, total, absolute darkness that seemed to have substance. The kind of darkness that wasn't just an absence of light, but a living thing. Something moved in that darkness. Not outside, not quite inside, existing in the impossible spaces between. The first physical evidence came around midnight. Blood, but not fresh. Old blood that seemed to seep through the wooden floorboards, creating patterns that looked almost like maps. Intricate, deliberate, each droplet positioned with a precision that suggested intelligence far beyond any natural explanation. The blood told a story, but not one I could fully comprehend. My scientific training battled with pure, primal fear. Every rational explanation I tried to construct fell apart. The blood patterns changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. Trails would rearrange, creating complex geometries that seemed to pulse with an internal logic. Something was communicating. Something was choosing. The research station's walls began to change. Not dramatically, but in ways that defied immediate perception. Wood grain shifted. Shadows moved independently of any light source. Photographs on the wall, previous survey teams, I assumed, started to alter. Faces blurring. Figures appearing where they shouldn't be. Watching. My equipment became a conduit for something else. The radio crackled with voices. Not static, not interference, but actual voices. Fragments of conversations. Previous researchers. Warning about something. Don't follow the trail, one voice repeated. It chooses you. The voices weren't human anymore. They were something else. Something that had been collected. Something was inside the station with me. Not entering through doors or windows. Simply existing. A presence that understood space differently. Sometimes visible in peripheral vision. A shape composed of forest shadows, of twisted branches and something darker. Something that remembered being human once, but had long since become something else. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, but in sharp, impossible plunges. My breath became visible, then would vanish. Electronic devices flickered with impossible patterns. My satellite phone displayed coordinates that didn't exist on any map. Locations that were both everywhere and nowhere. When I turned, it was looking at me. Not a creature, not an animal. Something that wore the memory of human form like a poorly fitted skin. And it was smiling. Survival became a mathematical problem with impossible variables. The forest was no longer a landscape. It was a living system designed to contain, to select, to consume. My truck represented my only potential escape. But I understood quickly that escape was an illusion this environment was allowing me to believe. Every step towards the truck became a negotiation. The ground shifted. Roots rose like tentative fingers, testing. Branches bent in impossible angles, creating corridors that guided my movement. I wasn't choosing a path. The path was choosing me. Each movement felt choreographed by something watching, something calculating my every potential response. The creature, if you could call it that, followed, not chasing, herding, guiding me exactly where it wanted me to go. I could feel its presence in the way shadows moved differently, in the way temperature fluctuated, in the impossible silence that pressed against my eardrums. My scientific equipment became both a lifeline and a threat. Sensors detected impossible readings, temperature variations that defied physics, electromagnetic fluctuations that suggested something was manipulating reality itself. The forest was studying me as much as I had been studying it. The truck started, but something started with it. Not just a mechanical sound, but a resonance. A frequency that suggested the vehicle was now part of whatever system was controlling this space. The engine made sounds that weren't quite mechanical, sounds that suggested something was alive inside the machinery. Escape was never going to be simple. The forest understood movement, understood intention. Each mile I drove felt like I was being allowed to move, guided by something with a purpose far beyond my comprehension. The trail behind me wasn't just a physical path. It was a living memory, collecting, documenting, selecting. Dawn broke differently here. Light that wasn't quite light. A spectrum that suggested reality was more malleable than I'd ever understood. My truck was miles from the research station, but I knew the distance was meaningless. Whatever had chosen me was still present. The photographs in my camera told a different story than what I remembered. Images of the research station, of the forest, but not as they were, as they had been, decades ago, with figures standing in windows, watching, waiting. The images shifted each time I looked away. My professional report would be clinical, precise, nothing about what actually happened, just standard survey notes that said nothing and everything. The medical examination would show no trauma, no evidence of what I'd experienced, just another researcher with an impossible story. But I knew the truth. The forest knew the truth. Some ecosystems are hunters. Some research is not meant to be completed. And some trails are designed to be followed, not escaped.